Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight we're going to explore a case that highlights the devastating intersection of disability, domestic violence, and the failures of our protective systems. This is the story of Christina Perdon, a 27-year-old woman from Edina, Minnesota, whose life was tragically cut short in January 2018. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves domestic violence, so take care of yourself and know that if you're experiencing domestic violence, help is available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Let me tell you about Christina, a woman whose infectious smile and laughter could light up any room, despite the challenges she faced every day. Christina Perdon lived in Edina, Minnesota, a quiet suburb southwest of Minneapolis known for its tree-lined streets and well-maintained neighborhoods. At 27 years old, Christina navigated life with epilepsy, a neurological condition that made even simple daily tasks more complex than they might seem to others. Epilepsy affects roughly 3.4 million people in the United States. For Christina, it meant living with the constant awareness that a seizure could happen at any moment. It meant carefully managing medications, avoiding certain triggers, and often relying on others for support during her most vulnerable moments. But Christina was far more than her medical condition. Those who knew her described her as someone who approached life with remarkable resilience and joy. She had dreams, aspirations, and the same desires for love and companionship that we all share. Her mother, Livia Perdon, would later speak of her daughter's infectious personality and her determination to live life fully despite the additional challenges she faced. Living with epilepsy often means depending on support systems, family, friends, caregivers, and sometimes service animals. For Christina, she had a service dog who provided both practical assistance and emotional comfort. Service dogs, for people with epilepsy, are trained to detect oncoming seizures, provide stability during episodes, and even summon help when needed. These animals become not just assistants, but beloved companions and lifelines. Christina's apartment on Park Lawn Avenue in Edina represented her independence. Like many young adults, she valued having her own space, making her own decisions, and building relationships on her terms. The neighborhood was generally quiet and safe, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and looked out for one another. However, independence for someone with a disability can sometimes create vulnerability, especially when it comes to relationships. The very support systems that enable independence can sometimes be exploited by those with harmful intentions. This tragic reality would become central to understanding what happened to Christina. In the disability rights community, there's a well-documented concern about the higher rates of domestic violence experienced by people with disabilities. Statistics show that people with disabilities are up to 3 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence than those without disabilities. The reasons are complex. Increased dependence on caregivers, social isolation, communication barriers, and unfortunately the targeting of vulnerable individuals by predators. Christina's story would become part of these sobering statistics. But at this point in her life, she was simply a young woman trying to navigate relationships like anyone else. She was someone who laughed easily, who brought joy to those around her, and who deserved to feel safe and loved in her own home. In the complex landscape of modern dating, Christina met Joseph Porter. He was 25 years old, originally from Arkansas, and like many relationships in the digital age, theirs likely began with promise and hope. Initial attraction, shared interests, the excitement of getting to know someone new. From the outside, it may have appeared like any other young couple beginning their journey together. Joseph Porter presented himself in a way that initially attracted Christina. In the early stages of abusive relationships, perpetrators often engage in what experts call love bombing, an overwhelming display of affection, attention, and charm designed to quickly create emotional dependency. They appear to be everything their victim has been looking for: attentive, caring, understanding. For someone like Christina, who may have faced social challenges related to her disability, having someone show intense interest and affection could have been particularly appealing. Society often sends messages that people with disabilities are less desirable romantic partners. A harmful and completely false narrative that can make genuine attention feel especially precious. Porter likely learned about Christina's epilepsy early in their relationship. A caring partner would educate themselves about the condition, learn about triggers and treatments, and become part of Christina's support system. Unfortunately, abusers often view a partner's vulnerabilities not as something to protect, but as tools to exploit. Epilepsy can create moments of physical vulnerability during seizures, in the postictal state that follows, or even just in the fatigue that often accompanies the condition. A loving partner provides comfort and assistance during these times. An abuser sees opportunities for control. As their relationship progressed, Porter began moving between Minnesota and Arkansas. This kind of transient lifestyle can be another tool of control, keeping a partner isolated from their established support systems, creating uncertainty, and making it difficult for friends and family to maintain consistent contact. The relationship dynamics began to shift. What may have started as attentiveness gradually transformed into possessiveness. Care became control. Love became manipulation. These transitions often happen so gradually that victims don't recognize the pattern until they're deeply embedded in the cycle of abuse. Porter's behavior toward Christina began to escalate beyond emotional manipulation. Physical violence entered the relationship. For Christina, whose epilepsy already made her more vulnerable to injury, any physical violence posed additional risks. Head trauma, in particular, can trigger seizures or worsen existing epilepsy. But perhaps one of the most telling and disturbing aspects of Porter's behavior was his treatment of Christina's service dog. This animal wasn't just a pet, it was a medical necessity, a trained professional assistant that helped Christina navigate her daily life safely. Porter's violence toward this innocent animal revealed the depths of his cruelty and his complete disregard for Christina's well-being and independence. The abuse of service animals is particularly heinous because these animals are selected and trained specifically for their gentle, non-aggressive temperaments. They're taught to remain calm in stressful situations, to focus on their handler's needs, and to provide assistance without defensive behaviors. This makes them easy targets for abusers who want to terrorize their victims without facing retaliation. When Porter struck Christina's service dog, he was attacking her independence, her safety net, and her emotional support all at once. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to strip away one of her most important sources of security and autonomy. The psychological impact of watching someone harm your service animal cannot be overstated. For Christina, this would have been traumatizing on multiple levels. Witnessing animal cruelty, losing faith in her safety, and realizing that someone she trusted was capable of such calculated cruelty. As 2017 progressed into 2018, the violence in Christina and Joseph Porter's relationship escalated dramatically. What had begun as emotional manipulation and control had evolved into a pattern of serious physical abuse that would ultimately prove fatal. The cycle of domestic violence follows a predictable pattern that researchers and advocates have documented extensively. It begins with a tension-building phase, where minor incidents and verbal abuse create an atmosphere of walking on eggshells. This escalates to an acute battering incident, the explosion of violence that often shocks victims with its severity. Following this comes the honeymoon phase, where the abuser expresses remorse, makes promises to change, and often convinces the victim that the violence was an aberration that won't happen again. For Christina, this cycle became increasingly dangerous. Porter's violence wasn't just emotionally devastating. It posed serious medical risks, given her epilepsy. Physical trauma, particularly to the head, can trigger seizures in people with epilepsy. Stress and fear are also known seizure triggers, meaning the psychological abuse was potentially as dangerous as the physical violence. During this period, something particularly tragic occurred. Christina suffered a miscarriage. While miscarriages can happen for many reasons, the timing suggests it may have been related to the physical violence she was enduring. Domestic violence is a leading cause of maternal mortality and pregnancy loss. The fact that Porter's abuse continued even while Christina was pregnant reveals the depths of his disregard for human life. The loss of a pregnancy is devastating under any circumstances, but losing a pregnancy due to violence adds layers of trauma that are difficult to comprehend. For Christina, this loss represented not just the death of her unborn child, but a stark realization of the danger she faced. It may have been a turning point in her understanding of just how far Porter was willing to go. Porter's cruelty extended beyond violence toward Christina herself. In Arkansas, he reportedly killed a puppy, This act of animal cruelty might seem unrelated to domestic violence, but researchers have long documented the connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence. The same mentality that allows someone to harm a defenseless animal often extends to harming vulnerable humans. The murder of the puppy served multiple purposes for Porter. It was an act of cruelty that demonstrated his capacity for violence, a warning to Christina about what he was capable of, and a way to test boundaries and escalate control. Many domestic violence victims report that threats to or actual harm of beloved pets is used as leverage to maintain control over them. For Christina, watching Porter harm animals would have been terrifying. It demonstrated that his capacity for violence had no bounds, that he could harm innocent creatures without remorse, and that her own safety was in constant jeopardy. During this time, Porter's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. The back and forth between Minnesota and Arkansas continued, creating instability and making it difficult for Christina to maintain consistent connections with local support systems. This isolation is a common tactic used by abusers to maintain control over their victims. The abuse was taking its toll on every aspect of Christina's life. The physical violence was causing injury and pain. The emotional abuse was eroding her self-esteem and sense of reality. The stress was likely affecting her epilepsy, potentially increasing seizure frequency or severity. The isolation was cutting her off from friends, family, and community supports that might have been able to help. Yet, despite all of this, Christina was beginning to recognize that she needed to escape. The miscarriage, the violence toward her service dog, the escalating physical abuse. These events were helping her see that this relationship wasn't going to get better on its own. Porter wasn't going to change. If anything, he was becoming more dangerous over time. The decision to leave an abusive relationship is incredibly complex and dangerous. Statistics show that the period when a victim is leaving or has just left is often the most dangerous time, when homicide risk is highest. Abusers frequently escalate their violence when they sense they're losing control over their victim. Christina was about to make the brave decision to seek help and try to escape. But as we'll see, the systems designed to protect domestic violence victims would prove inadequate to keep her safe from Porter's escalating violence. By late 2017, Christina had reached a crucial realization. She needed help, and she needed to get away from Joseph Porter. The violence had escalated to a point where she could no longer hope it would stop on its own. The miscarriage, the abuse of her service animal, and the ongoing physical violence had made it clear that staying in this relationship could cost her life. Making the decision to seek help is one of the most difficult steps a domestic violence victim can take. There's often shame involved. Victims frequently blame themselves for the abuse or worry that others will judge them for staying in the relationship as long as they did. There's fear of retaliation from the abuser, who often threatens escalated violence if the victim tries to leave or seek help. For someone with a disability like Christina, these barriers can be even higher. There may be concerns about whether services will be accessible, or whether helpers will understand the unique challenges faced by people with disabilities. There can be additional worry about losing independence, or being placed in situations where autonomy is further compromised. Despite these challenges, Christina took the brave step of seeking legal protection. She obtained a restraining order against Porter, also known as an order for protection, or no contact order. This legal document prohibited Porter from contacting her, coming to her home, or being in her presence. Restraining orders serve several important purposes. They formally document the abuse, creating a legal record that can be used in future court proceedings. They provide clear legal boundaries that, if violated, can result in immediate arrest. They send a message to the abuser that the victim is serious about ending the relationship and has the support of the legal system. However, restraining orders are ultimately just pieces of paper. Their effectiveness depends on the abuser's willingness to comply with the law and on the ability of law enforcement to respond quickly when violations occur. For many domestic violence victims, restraining orders provide some measure of psychological comfort, a sense that they've taken action and that there are consequences for continued abuse. For Christina, obtaining the restraining order represented a significant step toward reclaiming her life and safety. It was an assertion of her right to live free from violence and harassment. It was also a recognition that she deserved better than what Porter had been giving her. The process of obtaining a restraining order typically requires documenting the abuse. Christina would have had to recount the violence she'd endured, describe the threats she'd received, and convince a judge that she was in genuine danger. For many victims, this process can be re-traumatizing, requiring them to relive painful experiences in a formal legal setting. But Christina persevered through this process because she understood it was necessary for her safety. The restraining order was granted, legally prohibiting Porter from contacting her or coming near her home on Park Lawn Avenue. Unfortunately, restraining orders are frequently violated. Studies suggest that between 40–70% of restraining orders are violated by the abuser. The violations can range from phone calls and text messages to showing up at the victim's home or workplace. Each violation represents not just a legal breach, but a renewed threat to the victim's safety. Porter's response to the restraining order would prove typical of many abusers. He had no intention of respecting Christina's right to safety or the authority of the legal system. The order, which represented Christina's attempt to create boundaries and protect herself, would ultimately prove insufficient to stop his escalating violence. During this period, Christina was likely experiencing a mix of emotions. There may have been relief at having taken legal action, hope that the worst was behind her, but also fear about Porter's reaction. Many domestic violence victims report that they feel most vulnerable immediately after obtaining restraining orders, uncertain whether the legal protection will translate into actual safety. Christina continued living in her apartment, trying to rebuild her sense of security and normalcy. She had her service dog for comfort and assistance. She had the legal protection of the restraining order. She had taken steps to prioritize her safety and well-being. But Porter was not willing to let her go. The restraining order, rather than deterring him, may have actually escalated his anger and sense of entitlement. Many abusers view legal intervention as an unacceptable challenge to their control over their victim. Rather than respecting boundaries, they see restraining orders as obstacles to overcome. What Christina couldn't have known was that Porter was already planning to violate the order in the most extreme way possible. The legal protections she had put in place, while important and necessary, would prove insufficient to stop someone determined to commit the ultimate act of control, murder. The final days of 2017 and the beginning of 2018 should have represented a new chapter for Christina Prodan. She had taken the courageous step of obtaining legal protection from Joseph Porter. She was trying to rebuild her life free from violence and fear. The restraining order was in place, creating a legal barrier between her and her abuser. But restraining orders are only as effective as the systems that enforce them. And unfortunately, these systems often fail when they're needed most. Between October 24, 2017, and early January 2018, Edina police responded to 19 calls for service at Christina's apartment on Park Lawn Avenue. 19 calls in roughly 2.5 months. That's nearly 2 calls per week. Each of these calls represented a moment when Christina felt unsafe enough to contact law enforcement. A cry for help in a situation that was clearly spiraling out of control. These numbers tell a story of a system under strain and a woman in escalating danger. 19 police responses should have been a massive red flag indicating that existing protections were insufficient and that Christina was at extreme risk. Each call represented not just a violation of the restraining order, but a step closer to a potentially fatal outcome. Domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous situations police officers face, but they're also among the most important. These calls offer opportunities to intervene before violence escalates to homicide. They provide chances to connect victims with additional resources, to arrest violators, and to send clear messages that domestic violence will not be tolerated. However, the reality is that police responses to domestic violence calls are often inadequate. Officers may minimize the danger, fail to make arrests even when violations are clear, or treat incidents as relationship problems rather than serious crimes. Victims often report feeling that their concerns aren't taken seriously or that the system views domestic violence as a private matter rather than a public safety issue. For Christina, each of these 19 calls represented a moment of hope. Hope that this time the system would provide effective protection, that Porter would face meaningful consequences for his behavior, or that somehow the escalating situation would be resolved. Each time the police left without providing lasting safety, that hope was eroded a little more. The frequency of these calls should have triggered additional interventions. Victim advocates should have been involved. Enhanced safety planning should have occurred. The possibility of relocating Christina to a safer location should have been explored. Porter should have faced escalating legal consequences for his repeated violations of the restraining order. Instead, the system seemed to treat each incident as isolated rather than recognizing the pattern of escalating danger. This is a common failure in domestic violence cases, responding to individual incidents rather than addressing the underlying pattern of power and control that drives the abuse. Christina's mother, Livia Prodan, was also trying to help her daughter navigate this dangerous situation. She had provided information to police about Porter's history of violence, including details about the rape, the abuse of Christina's service dog, and the killing of the puppy in Arkansas. This information painted a picture of an extremely dangerous individual, with a history of escalating violence toward both humans and animals. Yet Porter remained free to continue stalking and harassing Christina. The restraining order had become meaningless in practice, violated repeatedly without meaningful consequences. The police responses, while documented, hadn't resulted in Porter being held accountable for his actions or prevented from continued contact with Christina. By early January 2018, it should have been clear to everyone involved, police, prosecutors, victim advocates, and the courts, that Christina Prodan was in extreme danger and that existing protections were failing. The pattern of behavior, the frequency of violations, and Porter's history of violence all pointed toward a potentially lethal outcome. Tragically, the systems designed to protect domestic violence victims would fail Christina when she needed them most. Despite her courage in seeking help, despite the legal protections she had obtained, and despite the clear evidence of escalating danger, Joseph Porter remained free to commit the ultimate act of violence. January 4th, 2018 began like many other days for Christina Prodan. She was in her apartment on Parklawn Avenue, the space that represented her independence and should have been her sanctuary. The restraining order was still in effect. The police had been called to her home 19 times in recent months. She had done everything the system told her to do to stay safe. But Joseph Porter had made a decision that would end Christina's life and destroy the lives of everyone who loved her. Despite the legal prohibition against contacting Christina, Porter traveled to her apartment. This represented not just another violation of the restraining order, but a premeditated decision to confront her despite knowing it was illegal. He had to plan this visit, arrange transportation, decide on timing, and make the conscious choice to violate a court order designed to protect Christina from exactly this scenario. What happened next was exactly what domestic violence advocates and legal experts fear most. The moment when an abuser decides that if they can't control their victim, they will destroy them. Porter later confessed to what occurred in Christina's apartment that day. According to his own admissions, an argument began between them. For many people, arguments are normal parts of relationships, disagreements that get resolved through discussion or require cooling off periods. But for someone like Porter, who viewed Christina as property rather than as an autonomous person deserving of respect, any disagreement represented unacceptable defiance. The argument escalated quickly to violence. Porter began punching Christina repeatedly in the face. For someone with epilepsy, head trauma poses particular dangers. It can trigger seizures, cause brain injury, and potentially be fatal. Porter either didn't care about these risks or actively wanted to cause maximum harm. The facial injuries alone would have been serious, but Porter's violence didn't stop there. After the beating, he put Christina in a chokehold. Strangulation is one of the most dangerous forms of domestic violence. It can cause death within minutes and is often a precursor to homicide in abusive relationships. Studies show that domestic violence victims who have been strangled are 7 times more likely to eventually be killed by their abuser. Porter held the chokehold until Christina lost consciousness. Whether he intended to kill her at that moment or simply wanted to render her helpless, his actions demonstrated a complete disregard for her life. Strangulation can cause unconsciousness within seconds, but it can also cause death if maintained for just a few minutes longer. Christina Prodan died in her own home, the place where she should have been safest. She died at the hands of someone she had once trusted, someone she had tried to leave, someone the legal system should have kept away from her. Her service dog, the animal trained to protect and assist her, was helpless to prevent this ultimate act of violence. At 27 years old, Christina's life was over. All of her dreams, her hopes for the future, her relationships with family and friends, Everything ended in those violent moments in her apartment. The young woman who had faced the challenges of living with epilepsy with such grace and joy, who had tried so hard to escape an abusive relationship, who had done everything she was supposed to do to stay safe. She was gone. Porter's actions in those moments weren't just criminal, they were an indictment of every system that had failed to protect Christina, every unanswered call for help, every violation of the restraining order that went without meaningful consequences, every opportunity to intervene that was missed, had led to this moment. But Porter's violence didn't end with Christina's death. What he did next would add additional layers of horror to an already devastating crime and would cause immeasurable additional pain to Christina's family. Rather than calling for help, rather than feeling remorse, rather than turning himself in, Porter made the calculated decision to hide what he had done. He concealed Christina's body, beginning a cover-up that would rob her family of immediate closure and subject them to days of anguish, not knowing what had happened to their daughter. Christina Prodan deserved so much better. She deserved to live free from violence. She deserved to have her legal protections enforced. She deserved to be safe in her own home. She deserved to grow old, to pursue her dreams, to love and be loved without fear. Instead, she became another statistic in the epidemic of domestic violence that claims the lives of approximately 3 women every day in the United States. Her death was preventable, predictable, and the result of systematic failures that continue to endanger vulnerable people across our country. After murdering Christina Prodan in her Edina apartment, Joseph Porter faced a choice that would reveal even more about his character and complete lack of remorse. He could have called 911, claimed self-defense or accident, and faced the immediate consequences of his actions. Instead, he embarked on an elaborate cover-up that would compound the trauma for Christina's family and demonstrate the calculated nature of his crime. Porter's first priority was concealing evidence of what he had done. He placed Christina's body in a suitcase, reducing this vibrant, beloved woman to something to be hidden and discarded. The act of putting her in a suitcase was not just practical concealment, it was a final dehumanizing act that treated Christina as nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with. With Christina's body concealed, Porter began what would become a multi-state effort to avoid accountability. He loaded the suitcase into a vehicle and began driving south, leaving Minnesota and heading toward Louisiana. This wasn't a panic-driven flight, it was a planned journey with a specific destination and purpose in mind. Meanwhile, Christina's absence was becoming noticeable. When someone with epilepsy who relies on routine and medical management suddenly disappears, it raises immediate red flags. Her mother, Livia, knew something was wrong when she couldn't reach her daughter. Friends and family members who were accustomed to regular contact became concerned when Christina didn't respond to calls or messages. The investigation began as a missing person case. Edina Police, the same department that had responded to 19 calls at Christina's apartment in recent months, now faced the grim reality that their repeated interventions hadn't prevented the worst-case scenario. The apartment that had been the site of so many domestic violence calls was now a crime scene. Investigators began piecing together Christina's final days. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed the extensive history of domestic violence calls, and quickly identified Joseph Porter as the primary suspect. His history of violating the restraining order, combined with his sudden disappearance coinciding with Christina's, made him the obvious focus of their investigation. But Porter was already far from Minnesota, continuing his journey south with Christina's body. He drove through multiple states, each mile taking him further from the scene of his crime, but closer to an even more horrific act of desecration. Porter's destination was New Orleans, Louisiana, where he had access to property that would allow him to complete his plan to destroy evidence. In what investigators would later describe as an act of particular cruelty, Porter burned Christina's body in a shipping container. This wasn't just destruction of evidence. It was a final act of violence against someone who had already suffered too much. The burning of Christina's body served multiple purposes for Porter. It destroyed physical evidence that could be used against him in court. It made identification more difficult, potentially buying him time before authorities could confirm what had happened to Christina. Most cruelly, it deprived Christina's family of the ability to lay her to rest with dignity and to have a place to visit and mourn. While Porter was carrying out this destruction in Louisiana, the investigation in Minnesota was intensifying. Police had processed Christina's apartment and found evidence of violence. They had established a timeline of when she was last seen alive. They had identified Porter as the suspect and issued warrants for his arrest. The multi-state nature of Porter's flight complicated the investigation. It also demonstrated the premeditated nature of his actions. This wasn't a crime of passion where someone acted impulsively and then panicked. Porter had planned his escape route, traveled hundreds of miles, and carried out the destruction of evidence in a calculated manner. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states coordinated their efforts to locate Porter. The case had evolved from a local domestic violence incident to a multi-jurisdictional manhunt involving murder, interstate flight, and destruction of evidence. For Christina's family, these were days of agonizing uncertainty. They knew something terrible had happened, but they didn't yet have confirmation of Christina's fate. The not knowing, wondering if she was being held somewhere, hoping against hope that she might still be alive, added an additional layer of torture to an already devastating situation. When Porter was finally located and arrested, he bore physical evidence of his crimes. He had burn marks on his face, likely sustained while destroying Christina's body. These injuries would serve as physical evidence of his involvement in the cover-up and would connect him to the crime scene in Louisiana. The arrest brought some relief to investigators and Christina's family, but it also confirmed their worst fears. Porter's apprehension meant that the search for Christina was over, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The cover-up had been unsuccessful. Justice would be pursued, but Christina was gone forever. When Joseph Porter was arrested for the murder of Christina Prodan, he initially faced the prospect of a lengthy legal battle. Murder cases, particularly those involving domestic violence and interstate crimes, can take years to resolve through the court system. Families often endure extended periods of uncertainty, reliving trauma through testimony and evidence presentation, hoping that justice will eventually be served. However, Porter's case took a different path. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, his own admissions, physical evidence from the crime scene, the burn marks on his face, and the extensive history of domestic violence, Porter ultimately chose to accept responsibility for his actions rather than put Christina's family through a prolonged trial. On January 15, 2019, just over a year after Christina's murder, Joseph Porter pleaded guilty to second-degree unintentional murder. This plea represented an acknowledgement of his responsibility for Christina's death, while avoiding the additional trauma of a trial for her family. During the sentencing hearing, the full scope of Porter's cruelty became part of the official record. Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman didn't mince words, calling the murder heinous and acknowledging the particular cruelty involved in Porter's actions. The prosecutor noted that Porter had not called police after Christina's death, had hidden her body, and had caused additional stress and anguish for her mother through his cover-up attempts. Porter was sentenced to just over 20 years in prison, specifically 20 years and 3 months. While this sentence ensured that Porter would face significant consequences for his actions, it also meant that he would likely be released while still relatively young, able to rebuild his life in a way that Christina never could. For Christina's family, the sentencing brought a measure of closure, but it could never restore what they had lost. Livia Prodan had lost her daughter in the most traumatic way possible. She had endured the agony of not knowing what happened to Christina, followed by the horror of learning the truth about her daughter's final moments. The case highlighted numerous systemic failures that had contributed to Christina's death. The 19 police calls to her apartment represented 19 opportunities for more effective intervention. The restraining order that was repeatedly violated without meaningful consequences demonstrated the inadequacy of existing legal protections. The intersection of disability and domestic violence revealed how society's most vulnerable members often lack adequate protection. Christina's story became part of the Disability Day of Mourning, an annual event that honors people with disabilities who have been murdered by caregivers, family members, or others. Her inclusion in this memorial recognizes how her epilepsy made her more vulnerable to abuse and how the systems designed to protect her failed to account for her specific needs and circumstances. The case also contributed to ongoing conversations about domestic violence prevention and response. Advocates point to cases like Christina's when arguing for enhanced penalties for restraining order violations, improved training for law enforcement, and better coordination between agencies serving domestic violence victims. Today, Joseph Porter remains incarcerated, serving his sentence for taking Christina's life. He will eventually be released, able to start over in a way that his victim never can. Meanwhile, Christina's family continues to grieve, to remember her infectious smile and laughter, and to live with the knowledge that she died because systems designed to protect her failed when she needed them most. Christina Prodan was 27 years old when she died. She had lived with epilepsy, faced additional challenges that many of us never experience, and still approached life with joy and resilience. She deserved to grow old, to pursue her dreams, to love and be loved safely. Instead, she became another statistic in the ongoing epidemic of domestic violence. Her story serves as a reminder that domestic violence affects people of all backgrounds, but that those with disabilities face additional vulnerabilities that require specialized understanding and protection. It reminds us that restraining orders are only as good as the systems that enforce them, and that preventing domestic violence homicides requires sustained commitment from law enforcement, courts, and communities. Most importantly, Christina's story reminds us that behind every statistic is a real person, with hopes, dreams, relationships, and an irreplaceable place in the lives of those who love them. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a person who brought light into the world, despite facing challenges that might have overwhelmed others. Please, I'm putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight we travel to the heart of Kentucky's bluegrass region, where rolling hills stretch endlessly beneath wide skies and small communities are bound together by generations of shared history. There exists a particular kind of closeness that comes from knowing your neighbors, from watching children grow up together, and from understanding that everyone's story is somehow connected to everyone else's. Richmond, Kentucky, is one such place, a town where families put down roots that grow deep into the fertile soil of tradition and community. This is the story of Savannah Spurlock, a young woman who embodied both the challenges and dreams of her generation. At 22 years old, she was navigating the complex terrain of young motherhood while still yearning for the kind of social connection and personal freedom that defines early adulthood. She was someone who loved deeply, laughed easily, and faced life's responsibilities with a determination that impressed everyone who knew her. On the night of January 4th, 2019, as winter settled over central Kentucky with the kind of crisp clarity that makes stars seem impossibly bright, Savannah was preparing for something that had become increasingly rare in her life. A night out with friends, after months of caring for her newborn twins, while also tending to her 2 older children. She was ready to step back into the world of young adulthood, to remember who she was beyond the roles of mother and caregiver. What began as a simple desire for an evening of friendship and normalcy would become one of Kentucky's most heartbreaking missing person cases, a tragedy that would expose the vulnerability of young women seeking connection in an unpredictable world. It's a story that speaks to the dreams we carry, the risks we sometimes don't see coming, and the devastating consequences when trust is placed in the wrong hands. As we journey through Savannah's story together, we'll explore the life of a young woman trying to balance motherhood with her own need for community and joy. The night when a long-awaited opportunity for fun transformed into nightmare, and the months of searching that would ultimately reveal a truth more horrible than anyone had imagined. We'll witness how a single evening can change everything, how evil can hide behind familiar faces, and how a community can come together to seek justice for someone who was taken far too soon. The Kentucky landscape, with its hidden hollows and remote farmland, has always been a place where secrets can be buried deep. But Savannah's story would not remain buried. Through the persistence of her family, the dedication of law enforcement, and the power of a community that refused to forget, the truth would eventually surface, bringing both justice and heartbreak in equal measure. Before we begin, get comfortable, dim the lights, as we explore the case of Savannah Spurlock, a young mother whose first night out in months became her last, and whose disappearance would test everything her community believed about safety, trust, and the lengths to which evil can reach. Savannah Nicole Spurlock was born into the kind of Kentucky family where love ran as deep as the state's limestone caves, and family bonds were as enduring as the ancient hills that defined the landscape. From her earliest years, she displayed the kind of nurturing spirit that seemed to predict her future role as a mother. Always the one who looked out for younger cousins, who made sure everyone felt included, and who could light up any gathering with her infectious laughter and genuine warmth. Growing up in Richmond, Kentucky, Savannah experienced the particular rhythm of small-town life, where everyone knew everyone else's business. where high school football games brought entire communities together, and where young people often found themselves torn between the comfort of familiar surroundings and dreams of something bigger beyond the county lines. She was popular in school, known for her outgoing personality and her ability to make friends across different social groups. But life had different plans for Savannah than the typical path of her peers. By her early 20s, she had become the mother of 4 children, including twins who were less than a year old when our story takes place. The responsibility of caring for 4 young lives would have overwhelmed many people her age. But Savannah approached motherhood with the same generous spirit that characterized everything else about her personality. Her days were filled with the beautiful chaos that comes with young children, feeding schedules that seem to change constantly, diaper changes that never seem to end, the challenges of keeping older children entertained while tending to infants, and the endless cycle of laundry, cleaning, and preparation that defines life with a large young family. Yet friends and family members consistently described Savannah as someone who seemed to thrive in the role of mother, who found joy in her children's laughter and purpose in their need. The twins, her youngest, had been born less than a year before that January night, adding a new layer of complexity and exhaustion to Savannah's already demanding life. Anyone who has experienced life with newborn twins understands the particular intensity of that experience. The sleep deprivation, the constant feeding cycles, the way that personal time becomes not just rare but seemingly impossible to imagine. But Savannah's children were more than just responsibility to her. They were the center of her world, the reason she worked so hard to create stability and happiness in their lives. She shared photos of them constantly on social media, celebrated their milestones with enthusiasm, and spoke about them with the kind of pride that made it clear that despite the challenges of young motherhood, she considered her children to be her greatest achievement. Her living situation reflected the reality of many young single mothers trying to make it on their own, while still needing support from family. She lived in Richmond with her mother, Ellen Spurlock, who had become not just a grandmother to Savannah's children, but an essential partner in their care. The arrangement worked well for everyone involved, providing Savannah with the support she needed while giving Ellen the joy of being closely involved in her grandchildren's daily lives. Ellen Spurlock was more than just a supportive mother. She was Savannah's closest friend and confidant. The two women had developed a kind of relationship that often emerges when young mothers need to rely on their own mothers for both practical and emotional support. They shared the responsibilities of childcare, household management, and the countless decisions that come with raising 4 young children. The financial realities of supporting a large family on a young single mother's income meant that luxuries were rare and personal time was almost non-existent. Savannah worked when she could, always trying to balance the need to contribute financially with the demands of caring for her children. Every dollar had to be stretched. Every decision had to be made with the children's needs as the primary consideration. Social life for someone in Savannah's position became something that happened in snatches of conversation during grocery store trips, in text message exchanges during nap time, or in the brief moments when children were occupied and she could scroll through social media to maintain connections with friends whose lives were moving along different paths. The kind of spontaneous social activities that defined many of her peers' lives had become distant memories. Her friends understood the constraints that motherhood had placed on Savannah's availability, but they also recognized that she needed adult companionship and the kind of social interaction that reminded her she was more than just mom. They made efforts to include her when possible, understanding that any social plans would need to work around childcare arrangements and the unpredictable schedules that come with young children. The social isolation that can accompany intensive motherhood was something Savannah struggled with periodically. While she loved her children deeply and found great purpose in caring for them, she was also a 22-year-old woman who sometimes longed for the kind of carefree social interaction that had once been a regular part of her life. She missed dancing, missed late-night conversations with friends, missed the feeling of dressing up for an evening out. When her friends began planning what would become that fateful night out in January, Savannah felt a stirring of excitement that she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility of an evening away from the responsibilities of motherhood, a chance to reconnect with friends and remember who she was beyond her role as a caregiver, seemed like exactly what she needed to recharge and refocus. The arrangement of childcare for the evening required the kind of careful coordination that any parent of multiple young children understands. Ellen Spurlock, as she had done countless times before, agreed to watch her grandchildren so that Savannah could have a rare evening out. It was the kind of generous gesture that grandparents make routinely, understanding that young parents need occasional breaks to maintain their mental health and personal identity. As January 4th approached, Savannah began to look forward to the evening with an anticipation that her family hadn't seen in months. She talked about what she might wear, made plans with friends about where they would go, and seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of dancing, laughing, and enjoying adult conversation without worrying about feeding schedules or diaper changes. The outfit she chose for the evening reflected both her personal style and her excitement about getting dressed up for the first time in months. She selected a burgundy pencil skirt that highlighted her figure, paired it with a black top that was both elegant and fun, and completed the look with stiletto heels that made her feel confident and attractive. It was the kind of outfit that said she was ready to have fun, ready to be seen as a vibrant young woman rather than just a tired mother. Her preparation routine for the evening took on special significance because it had been so long since she had engaged in the ritual of getting ready for a night out. The time spent on hair and makeup, the careful selection of accessories, the final check in the mirror, all of these became acts of reclaiming her identity as a young woman with her own desires and social needs. The other bar in Lexington, Kentucky, was the kind of establishment that attracted young adults from across central Kentucky who were looking for music, dancing, and the electric energy that comes with being part of a crowd of people, all seeking the same thing: a good time, connections with others, and a temporary escape from the responsibilities and stresses of daily life. Located in the heart of Lexington, it was easily accessible from the smaller communities that dotted the surrounding counties, making it a natural gathering place for young people from places like Richmond. On the evening of January 4th, 2019, the other bar was filled with the typical Friday night crowd, groups of friends celebrating the end of the work week, couples enjoying date nights, and individuals hoping to meet new people in the relaxed atmosphere that characterized the venue. The music was loud enough to encourage dancing, but not so overwhelming that conversation became impossible, and the lighting created the kind of ambiance that made everyone look their best. Savannah arrived at the bar with friends, and immediately it was clear that she was exactly where she wanted to be. After months of being defined primarily by her role as a mother, she was rediscovering the part of herself that was young, attractive, and social. She moved through the bar with confidence, greeting friends and acquaintances, dancing to music that reminded her how much she had missed this kind of environment. Her friends later described Savannah as being in exceptionally good spirits that evening. She was laughing more than they had seen in months, engaging in conversations with enthusiasm, and clearly enjoying the experience of being out in a social setting. The break from her routine responsibilities seemed to have recharged her energy and reminded her of aspects of her personality that had been dormant during the intensive period of early motherhood. The bar's atmosphere was typical of weekend nightlife in a college town like Lexington. Groups of people flowed between different areas of the establishment. Conversations were started and continued across multiple locations, and the social dynamic shifted throughout the evening as people met new acquaintances and reconnected with old friends. It was the kind of environment where connections were made easily and where the boundaries between different social groups became fluid. As the evening progressed, Savannah found herself part of the broader social fabric of the bar, talking with various people and enjoying the kind of spontaneous interactions that make nights out memorable. She was approached by different men throughout the evening, which was hardly surprising given her attractiveness and the confident energy she was projecting. For someone who had spent months focused primarily on childcare, the attention was flattering and reminded her of her appeal as a young woman. Among the people Savannah encountered that evening were three men who would become central to the mystery that was about to unfold. David Sparks, who was 23 years old, was accompanied by two friends, and they had noticed Savannah early in the evening. Like many young men in similar settings, they were attracted to her beauty and vivacious personality, and they made efforts to engage her in conversation and invite her to join their group. The interaction between Savannah and the three men appeared, to outside observers, to be typical of bar social dynamics. There was conversation, laughter, and the kind of casual flirtation that characterizes many social interactions in nightlife settings. Savannah seemed comfortable with the attention and engaged willingly in the social interaction, showing no signs of distress or discomfort with the men's company. As the evening continued, the group dynamics evolved in ways that seemed natural and unremarkable to anyone watching. Savannah spent time talking with the three men, dancing with them, and appearing to enjoy their company. Her friends, who were also engaged in their own social interactions throughout the bar, periodically checked on her but saw nothing that raised concerns about her safety or well-being. The bar's surveillance cameras captured much of the evening's social interactions, providing a digital record of what appeared to be a normal night of young adults socializing, drinking, and enjoying themselves. The footage showed Savannah moving freely throughout the establishment, engaging with various people, and displaying the kind of relaxed body language that suggested she was having the good time she had been looking forward to. As the evening wore on, Savannah's friends began to make their own plans for how the night would end. Some were ready to head home, others wanted to continue the evening at different venues, and the natural process of group dissolution that characterizes most social gatherings began to occur. These decisions about how to conclude the evening would prove to be more significant than anyone realized at the time. Savannah faced the kind of decision that young adults make routinely during nights out, whether to leave with her original group of friends, or continue the evening with new acquaintances who were suggesting different plans. The three men she had been socializing with were inviting her to continue the party at a different location, and the prospect of extending what had been such an enjoyable evening was appealing. The decision to leave the other bar with David Sparks and his two friends was captured on the establishment's surveillance cameras, providing the last confirmed sighting of Savannah alive and moving freely. The footage showed her walking toward the exit with the three men, appearing relaxed and voluntary in her movements, showing no signs that she felt threatened or was leaving against her will. For her friends who remained at the bar, Savannah's departure with the three men was not immediately concerning. They had observed her interacting with the men throughout the evening, and had seen nothing that raised red flags about the situation. In the context of normal social interactions, leaving a bar with people you had been socializing with was not unusual behavior, and her friends assumed she was simply continuing her evening with new companions. The timestamp on the surveillance footage showing Savannah leaving the other bar was approximately 2:30 a.m. on January 5th. She was wearing the burgundy skirt and black top she had selected so carefully for her evening outs, carrying her purse, and walking under her own power toward what she believed would be the continuation of a fun night with new friends. What Savannah couldn't have known as she left the other bar was that she was walking toward a situation that would transform from social interaction to deadly encounter. The men she was leaving with, particularly David Sparks, harbored intentions that went far beyond the casual socializing that had characterized their interactions at the bar. The transition from the public space of the bar, with its crowds, surveillance cameras, and general atmosphere of social accountability, to the private space where the group was headed, represented a critical shift in the power dynamics and safety considerations that would determine Savannah's fate. Once she left the relative safety of the public venue, she would be entirely dependent on the good intentions of people she had just met. The drive from Lexington to Garrard County on that January night took the group through the kind of rural Kentucky landscape that can seem either peaceful or ominous, depending on your perspective and circumstances. Rolling hills, scattered farmhouses, and long stretches of road with minimal lighting created an environment that was beautiful in daylight but took on a different character in the darkness of early morning hours. Savannah, sitting in the vehicle with three men she had met only hours earlier, was likely expecting the night to continue with the same kind of social interaction that had characterized their time at the other bar. In her mind, they were probably heading to another party, perhaps someone's house where music would continue, drinks would flow, and the good times would extend into the early morning hours. It was exactly the kind of spontaneous adventure that she had been missing during her months of intensive motherhood. David Sparks, who was driving, had his own plans for how the evening would unfold, plans that differed drastically from what Savannah was expecting. While she was anticipating continued socializing and fun, he was leading her toward a location where he would have complete control over the situation, and where her safety would depend entirely on his intentions, which were far from benevolence. The address they were heading to was 1118 Price Court in Garrard County, a location that would become central to the investigation that would follow. This was not Sparks' own residence, but rather a property where he had access and where he could bring Savannah without the oversight or interruption that might have occurred in a more public or populated setting. During the drive, the conversation in the vehicle likely continued in the casual, flirtatious manner that had characterized their interactions at the bar. Savannah would have had no reason to suspect that her companions harbored dangerous intentions, and the social dynamics probably seemed like a natural continuation of the evening's social interactions. The other two men in the vehicle were later cleared of involvement in what was about to occur, suggesting that they, like Savannah, may not have been aware of Sparks' true intentions. The rural nature of the destination, meant that once they arrived, Savannah would be far from the kind of help or intervention that might have been available in a more populated area. The isolation of the location was not accidental. It provided Sparks with the privacy he needed to act on intentions that he had concealed during their public interactions at the bar. As they arrived at the Price Court address, the situation began its transformation from social gathering to something far more sinister. The other two men who had accompanied them from the bar would later provide testimony about the evening's events, though the exact timeline and their level of awareness about what was transpiring would become subjects of investigation and legal proceedings. What happened next, in the early morning hours of January 5, 2019, would be reconstructed later through physical evidence, witness testimony, and Sparks' own eventual confession. The young woman who had left the other bar expecting to continue a night of fun and social connection instead found herself in a situation where her life was in immediate danger. According to the information that would later emerge during the investigation and legal proceeding, Savannah was killed during those early morning hours at the Garrett County location. The exact circumstances of her death would remain partially unclear, as Sparks' confession provided some details while leaving others to be inferred from physical evidence and witness accounts. The transformation of what had appeared to be consensual social interaction into lethal violence represents one of the most chilling aspects of Savannah's case. She had made what seemed like reasonable decisions based on normal social cues and interactions, yet those decisions led her into the presence of someone capable of extreme violence who had successfully concealed his dangerous nature during their public interactions. After killing Savannah, Sparks engaged in deliberate actions to conceal his crime and dispose of evidence. According to court documents that would later be filed, he bound her legs and wrapped her body in plastic bags, actions that demonstrated premeditation and a clear understanding of the gravity of what he had done. These were not the actions of someone who had acted impulsively and then panicked, but rather the calculated steps of someone who was attempting to avoid detection and accountability. The disposal of Savannah's body involved transporting her remains to a location where Sparks believed they would not be discovered. The rural nature of Garrett County, with its farms, wooded areas, and remote locations, provided numerous options for someone attempting to hide evidence of a serious crime. Sparks chose a location that he believed would keep his secret indefinitely. The other two men who had been present during the early part of the evening would later be questioned extensively about what they had witnessed and when they had left the scene. Their testimony would become crucial to understanding the timeline of events and establishing the circumstances under which Savannah had died. The investigation would eventually clear them of involvement in her death, but their presence during part of the evening made them important witnesses to the events that preceded the tragedy. As dawn broke over Kentucky on January 5, 2019, Savannah Spurlock was dead, her body hidden in a location where Sparks believed it would never be found. Her 4 children were waking up in Richmond, probably expecting their mother to return home with stories of her night out, ready to resume her role as the loving, dedicated parent they depended on. But Savannah would never return home. The night that was supposed to remind her of who she was beyond motherhood had instead become the night that ended her life, leaving her children without their mother and her family with questions that would torment them for months before answers finally emerged. Saturday morning, January 5, 2019, began like countless other mornings in the Spurlock household in Richmond, Kentucky. Ellen Spurlock woke to the familiar sounds of her grandchildren beginning their day, the crying of the twins who needed feeding, the stirring of the older children who would soon need breakfast, and the general bustle that accompanies any household with 4 young children. But something was different that morning. Savannah, who had been out for her first social evening in months, had not returned home. Ellen initially assumed that her daughter had simply stayed out later than expected, perhaps continuing the party somewhere else, or deciding to spend the night with friends rather than driving home in the early morning hours. Such decisions were not unusual for young adults, and after the constraints Savannah had been living under, an extended night out wouldn't have been entirely surprising. As the morning progressed and Savannah still didn't return or communicate, Ellen's initial understanding began to shift toward concern. Savannah was a responsible mother who rarely went long periods without checking in, especially when she knew her children would need her attention. The absence of any text messages or phone calls began to feel uncharacteristic and worrying. The children, particularly the older ones, began asking for their mother as the day wore on. Ellen found herself making excuses and providing reassurances, while privately becoming more concerned about Savannah's whereabouts. The twins needed feeding on their regular schedule. The older children required attention and care, and Ellen was managing all of this while trying to understand why Savannah hadn't come home or made contact. By late Saturday afternoon, Ellen's concern had transformed into genuine worry. She began trying to reach Savannah through multiple methods, calling her cell phone repeatedly, sending text messages, and reaching out through social media platforms. All of these attempts at communication went unanswered, which was completely unlike Savannah's typical behavior patterns. Ellen also began contacting Savannah's friends, trying to piece together information about the previous evening and determine if anyone had heard from her daughter since she had left for her night out. The friends who had been at the other bar with Savannah reported that she had left the establishment with 3 men they didn't know well, but they hadn't thought much of it at the time because Savannah had seemed comfortable with the situation. The realization that Savannah had left the bar with strangers, rather than friends she knew well, added a new dimension to Ellen's growing alarm. While leaving a bar with new acquaintances wasn't necessarily dangerous, it did mean that the people who might have information about Savannah's whereabouts were individuals that her family and close friends couldn't easily identify or contact. As Saturday evening arrived and then passed without any word from Savannah, Ellen made the difficult decision to contact law enforcement. The choice to report someone as missing is never made lightly, especially when that person is an adult who has the right to make their own decisions about where to go and when to return home. But Ellen's maternal instincts and her knowledge of Savannah's character told her that something was seriously wrong. The Richmond Police Department responded to Ellen's missing person report with the professionalism and concern that such cases require, but they also had to balance the urgency of the situation with the statistical reality that most missing person cases involving adults are resolved quickly when individuals return on their own or make contact with family members. The first 48 hours of any missing person case are critical, but they are also the period when law enforcement must determine whether they are dealing with voluntary absence or something more serious. Detective work began immediately, with attempts to trace Savannah's movements on the night she disappeared. The other bar's surveillance footage became crucial evidence, providing clear documentation of Savannah leaving the establishment with 3 men in the early morning hours of January 5th. This footage gave investigators their first concrete leads and helped establish a timeline for the beginning of their investigation. The process of identifying the 3 men who had left the bar with Savannah required careful analysis of the surveillance footage and interviews with other patrons who might have witnessed their interactions during the evening. Bar staff were questioned about whether they remembered the group and if they had observed anything unusual about their behavior or interactions. Cell phone records became another crucial element of the investigation. Savannah's phone had gone silent at the same time she disappeared, providing no GPS tracking data or communication records that might have indicated where she had gone after leaving the bar. The absence of any electronic trail was both puzzling and concerning to investigators who relied heavily on such digital evidence in missing person cases. As the investigation expanded, law enforcement began the process of canvassing the route between Lexington and the surrounding counties, looking for any witnesses who might have seen Savannah or the vehicle she was traveling in during the early morning hours when she disappeared. This type of investigation required extensive coordination between different law enforcement agencies and careful analysis of potential leads. The media attention that Savannah's disappearance generated was both helpful and challenging for the investigation. News coverage helped spread awareness of the case and generated tips from the public, but it also created pressure for quick results and attracted attention that sometimes complicated investigative efforts. Ellen Spurlock became the public face of the search for her daughter, making emotional appeals for information and maintaining hope that Savannah would be found alive. Social media played a significant role in spreading awareness about Savannah's disappearance, with friends and family members creating campaigns to share her photograph and information about her case. The digital networking that had been part of Savannah's social life became a tool for organizing search efforts and keeping public attention focused on finding her. The investigation took on increasing urgency as days passed without any trace of Savannah or her whereabouts. The statistical reality that missing person cases become more difficult to solve as time passes created pressure on law enforcement to pursue all available leads quickly and thoroughly. Every day that passed without finding Savannah made her family's situation more desperate and the investigation more challenging. Volunteer search efforts were organized by community members who were moved by Savannah's story and concerned about what her disappearance might mean for public safety in their area. These searches focused on areas where someone might be found if they had been injured or where evidence might be hidden if foul play was involved. As January turned into February with no sign of Savannah Spurlock, Her disappearance transformed from a local concern into a regional case that captured the attention of law enforcement agencies, media outlets, and concerned citizens throughout Kentucky and beyond. The image of a young mother who had vanished after her first night out in months resonated with people who understood both the universal desire for social connection and the particular vulnerabilities that accompany attempts to balance personal needs with parental responsibilities. Ellen Spurlock emerged as a tireless advocate for finding her daughter, demonstrating the kind of fierce maternal determination that refuses to accept uncertainty when a child is missing. She organized search efforts, coordinated with law enforcement, spoke to media outlets, and maintained the social media presence that kept Savannah's case in the public eye. Her efforts were motivated not just by hope but by the practical understanding that sustained attention would be crucial for generating leads and maintaining investigative momentum. The Kentucky State Police became heavily involved in the investigation as it became clear that Savannah's disappearance likely involved crossing county lines and might require resources beyond those available to local law enforcement agencies. The state police brought additional expertise in missing person investigations, access to specialized equipment for searches, and the ability to coordinate efforts across multiple jurisdictions. Search efforts expanded to include systematic examination of rural areas throughout central Kentucky, focusing particularly on locations that might be accessible to someone seeking to hide evidence or dispose of remains. Kentucky's landscape, with its combination of agricultural land, wooded areas, abandoned structures, and remote locations, presented enormous challenges for physical searches, but also provided the kind of locations where someone might attempt to conceal evidence of a serious crime. Volunteer organizations joined the search efforts, bringing both additional manpower and specialized expertise to the investigation. Search and rescue teams, canine units trained to detect human remains, and groups of concerned citizens all contributed to the systematic examination of areas where Savannah might be found. These efforts required careful coordination to ensure that potential evidence was not disturbed, and that search personnel remained safe while examining challenging terrain. The identification of the 3 men who had left the other bar with Savannah became a breakthrough in the investigation, providing law enforcement with specific individuals to interview and investigate. David Sparks and his 2 companions became persons of interest in the case, subject to questioning about their interactions with Savannah and their knowledge of what had happened to her after they left the bar. The interview process with the 3 men revealed discrepancies and inconsistencies that raised additional concerns for investigators. While 2 of the men provided accounts that seemed credible and consistent, David Sparks's version of events raised questions that would become increasingly important as the investigation continued. His description of the evening's events and his explanation for why he and Savannah had parted ways did not align perfectly with other evidence or witness accounts. Law enforcement began focusing more intensively on Sparks as the investigation progressed, examining his background, his previous interactions with women, and his activities in the days following Savannah's disappearance. This type of detailed investigation required careful coordination between different agencies and extensive analysis of digital evidence, financial records, and witness testimony. The property at 1118 Price Court in Garrett County became a focal point of the investigation, as law enforcement learned more about Sparks' connection to the location and his access to the property. Search warrants were obtained to examine the premises thoroughly, looking for any evidence that might indicate what had happened to Savannah or where she might be found. Forensic examination of the Price Court property revealed evidence that supported the theory that Savannah had been present there and that something violent had occurred. While the specific details of this evidence were not immediately released to the public, the discovery of forensic indicators that connected Savannah to the location represented a significant development in the investigation. As spring arrived in Kentucky, the search efforts continued with renewed intensity, driven by the hope that warmer weather and improved conditions might reveal evidence that had been concealed during the winter months. Search teams returned to areas that had been examined earlier, using different techniques and equipment to look for signs that might have been missed during initial searches. The emotional toll of the prolonged search began to affect everyone involved in efforts to find Savannah. Her family struggled with the uncertainty and the growing fear that she might never be found alive, while investigators faced the pressure of a high-profile case that seemed to resist resolution despite intensive efforts. Community volunteers who had donated countless hours to search efforts began to grapple with the possibility that their work might not lead to the outcome everyone was hoping for. Media coverage of Savannah's case continued throughout the months of searching, with regular updates on investigative progress and continued appeals for public assistance. The story resonated with audiences beyond Kentucky, attracting national attention and bringing additional resources to the search efforts. Television programs focusing on missing persons cases featured Savannah's story, expanding the audience of people who might have information relevant to her disappearance. The investigation's focus on David Sparks intensified as evidence continued to point toward his involvement in Savannah's disappearance. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, forensic evidence, and inconsistencies in his own statements created a pattern that suggested he had knowledge about what had happened to Savannah that he was not sharing with investigators. The development of probable cause to arrest Sparks required careful assembly of evidence and coordination with prosecutors, who would eventually be responsible for pursuing charges related to Savannah's disappearance. The legal standards for making arrests and filing charges meant that investigators had to build a case that would withstand scrutiny in court, while also serving the immediate goal of preventing Sparks from potentially harming others. As the 6-month anniversary of Savannah's disappearance approached, the investigation reached a critical juncture where law enforcement had to decide whether they had sufficient evidence to make arrests and file charges, or whether they needed to continue building their case while risking that additional time might allow evidence to be destroyed or witnesses to become unavailable. July 10, 2019, marked exactly 6 months and 5 days since Savannah Spurlock had vanished from the other bar in Lexington, Kentucky. For her family, each of those days had been an eternity of uncertainty, hope, and growing dread. For investigators, the case had become an intensive focus that demanded resources, coordination, and the kind of persistence that characterizes the most challenging missing person investigations. On that July morning, law enforcement officials received information that would finally break the case open. The details of how this information was obtained would remain partially sealed in court documents, but it led investigators to a specific location in Garrett County where they believed they might find answers to the questions that had haunted the investigation for months. The information led investigators to a location they had searched before, the Sparks family farm in Garrett County. Savannah's body was found buried in a clandestine grave on Sparks' family's Garrett County farm, which police had previously searched. This time, however, they knew exactly where to look. The grave was just 19 inches deep. Savannah's body was inside, naked and wrapped in trash bags, her body folded over with a rug behind her back. Savannah's feet were bound with tape. The discovery confirmed the worst fears that had haunted her family and the investigative team for 6 months. The condition in which Savannah's remains were found told a story of deliberate concealment and disrespect that added another layer of horror to an already tragic case. Her remains were found underground, concealed in an unnatural position, evidence of the calculated nature of the crime and the perpetrator's attempts to hide his actions permanently. David Sparks was charged with tampering with physical evidence and the abuse of a corpse. He was held at the Madison County Detention Center and was due in court on Monday, July 15 at 9 a.m. for a preliminary hearing. The charges were serious, but they were only the beginning of what would become a complex legal process. The arrest brought some measure of relief to Savannah's family, who had endured months of uncertainty about what had happened to their daughter and mother. Ellen Spurlock, who had spent countless hours organizing searches and maintaining public awareness of the case, finally had answers, though they were not the answers she had hoped for. The fact that the same property had been searched about 4 months earlier raised questions about how the initial search had missed Savannah's remains. The shallow grave and the rural location had successfully concealed her body during the earlier search efforts, demonstrating how challenging such investigations can be even when investigators are focusing on the right areas. As part of the initial investigation by Richmond PD, the 3 men last seen with Savannah Spurlock were identified and interviewed, one of which was David Sparks. The investigation indicated that Savannah Spurlock was seen at the residence of David Sparks during the morning hours of January 5th. David Sparks was brought into a courtroom in shackles, chains, and a bulletproof vest for his initial court appearance. Sparks was arrested in July of 2019 after Spurlock disappeared in January of that year and initially maintained his innocence. The legal proceedings began with Sparks pleading not guilty to the charges against him. He claimed that Spurlock had woken him up in the early morning hours to ask the address of the home, like someone was coming to pick her up, and that he'd gone back to sleep. "I got up, she wasn't there, and she was gone," Sparks told police in the interview. However, as the case progressed and the weight of evidence mounted against him, Sparks's position began to change. The investigation had uncovered forensic evidence, witness testimony, and inconsistencies in his story that made his guilt increasingly clear to prosecutors, and eventually to Sparks himself. Nearly 2 years after Savannah's disappearance, the case reached its conclusion when David Sparks, 25, entered a guilty plea on charges of murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abuse of a corpse in Garrett County Circuit Court for the death of 23-year-old Savannah Spurlock. A source close to the case revealed that David Sparks pleaded guilty to acting alone in her murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. This admission finally brought legal closure to a case that had haunted the community for nearly 2 years. According to Garrett County court records, Sparks pleaded guilty to murder for a sentence of 50 years, tampering with physical evidence with a sentence of 5 years, and abuse of a corpse with a sentence of 12 months to be served concurrently. On December 17, 2020, David Sparks was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The family of Savannah Spurlock watched the sentencing via Zoom at the Jessamine Garrard County Commonwealth's Attorney Office in Nicholasville. The sentencing brought mixed emotions for Savannah's family. While justice had been served, Spurlock's family said that Sparks got it easy, noting, "While they have been through a nightmare, he will be eligible for parole in 20 years, a prospect that troubled the family." As one family member stated, "He may take it to think he is out in 20 years. No, sir. Our fight has just begun, because Mr. Sparks, her sons, will be grown men, fighting for a mother he stole from them." Spurlock's relatives revealed that police and prosecutors told them they don't know how or why Sparks killed her, as the autopsy came back inconclusive. Some questions about that January night would remain forever unanswered. But the truth about what happened to Savannah Spurlock had finally emerged. Savannah Nicole Spurlock was 22 years old when her life was cut short. She left behind 4 young children, including the twin babies she had been caring for so devotedly. Her story serves as a tragic reminder of the vulnerability that can accompany the simple desire for social connection, and the evil that can hide behind familiar faces. The case of Savannah Spurlock demonstrates both the persistence required to solve complex crimes and the devastating impact that violence has on families and communities. Her memory lives on in her children, and in the lessons her story teaches about safety, trust, and the precious nature of life itself. In the end, Savannah's first night out in months became her last, but her story continues to resonate as a reminder that every person deserves to live safely, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 3. The small town of Hampton, Iowa, sits quietly in the heart of the Midwest, where cornfields stretch endlessly toward distant horizons and everyone knows their neighbor's name. It's the kind of place where mysteries don't usually linger for long. Secrets have a way of surfacing in tight-knit communities, but for 7 long years, Hampton harbored one of the most perplexing disappearances in Iowa's recent history. A case that would ultimately reveal the tragic story of a young man whose life ended far too soon. Ethan Burt Kazmierzak was 22 years old in the autumn of 2013, a young man with his whole life stretching out before him like the Iowa prairie itself. Born and raised in Hampton, Ethan was deeply rooted in his community, carrying on a family legacy that ran through the very heart of the town's cultural life. His great-great-grandfather and great-grandfather had once owned and operated the historic Windsor Theater, and Ethan felt that artistic blood coursing through his veins. Music was Ethan's passion. He could play multiple instruments, each one becoming an extension of his soul when he picked it up. Whether it was the gentle strum of a guitar or the melodic flow of another instrument, Ethan found solace and expression in music. He wasn't just a performer, he was someone who understood that music could bridge the gaps between people, could tell stories that words alone couldn't capture. Standing about average height with dark blonde hair and a carefully maintained beard, Ethan weighed around 180 pounds and had the kind of presence that people remembered. He was a regular volunteer at the Windsor Theater, honoring his family's legacy while building his own. As a member of the Hampton United Methodist Church, he was woven into the fabric of the community in ways both seen and unseen. Those who knew Ethan described him as someone who participated enthusiastically in many branches of the arts. He wasn't just an observer of life, he was an active participant, someone who believed in contributing to the cultural richness of his small town. In Hampton, where entertainment options were limited and community involvement was valued, Ethan's contributions mattered. September 14th, 2013 was a Saturday night like many others in Hampton. The late summer air still held warmth, and the weekend brought the usual gathering of young people looking to unwind after a long week. For many in Iowa, this particular Saturday held special significance. It was the night of the annual Cy-Hawk game, the fierce rivalry between Iowa State University and the University of Iowa that divides the state in the most friendly way possible. Ethan spent the evening doing what many young people in small Iowa towns do on weekend nights. He made the rounds to the local establishments. First, he visited Pit Row, one of Hampton's gathering spots, where locals came to watch games, share stories, and catch up with friends. The atmosphere was lively, filled with the kind of camaraderie that comes from shared loyalty to college football teams and the simple pleasure of being part of a community. From Pit Row, Ethan made his way to the Red Moose, another local favorite. These weren't glamorous big city bars. They were the kinds of places where everyone knew the bartender's name and conversations flowed easily between strangers who weren't really strangers at all. The Red Moose had its own character, its own group of regulars, and Ethan fit right in. Later in the evening, Ethan ventured beyond Hampton's borders to Ducks in nearby Iredale. It was the kind of night that felt infinite, the way Saturday nights often do when you're 22 and surrounded by friends. The bars were filled with the energy of college football season, the excitement of autumn, and the easy laughter that comes from being young in a place where everyone understands the rhythm of your life. As the night progressed, word spread about a party happening at a gravel pit pond, located behind a house in the 1400 block of 90th Street. Just northwest of Hampton, the party spot was one of those places that every small town has. A location where young people gather when they want to be away from the watchful eyes of adults, where they can talk freely, laugh loudly, and feel the freedom that comes with being at the edge of adulthood. The gravel pit pond wasn't just any random location. It was the kind of place where memories were made, where relationships blossomed and sometimes ended, where the important conversations of young adulthood took place under starlit skies. For many in Hampton, it held the same significance that a favorite restaurant or coffee shop might hold in a larger city. It was a touchstone, a place where life happened. Around 12:15 in the morning on September 15th, as Saturday night blended into Sunday morning, Ethan made a phone call that would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in his disappearance. He called his mother, a conversation that seemed perfectly ordinary at the time but would later be analyzed and reanalyzed by investigators and family members searching for any clue about what happened next. During that call, Ethan told his mother something that millions of young adults have said to their parents over the years. He was on his way home. It was the kind of check-in that responsible kids make. The brief contact that lets worried parents know their child is thinking of them and planning to return safely. There was nothing unusual in his voice, nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. It was just a son calling his mother, probably over the noise of a party, letting her know he would be heading home soon. The call was made around midnight, 12:15 a.m. to be exact, but Ethan's cell phone records would later show activity until approximately 12:30 a.m. Those 15 minutes between his call home and his phone's last activity would become crucial to understanding the timeline of his disappearance. What happened in those 15 minutes? Did he leave the party immediately after calling his mother? Did he linger to say goodbye to friends? Did something unexpected occur that changed his plans? Witnesses at the party would later tell investigators that they remembered seeing Ethan around midnight, which aligned with the timing of his phone call. He was wearing a teal and white printed shirt and peach or orange shorts, the kind of casual summer clothing that was perfect for a late-night gathering by a pond. His dark blonde hair and beard made him distinctive enough that people remembered seeing him, but no one could pinpoint exactly when he left or whether he left alone. The party at the gravel pit continued after Ethan's departure, as parties often do. People came and went, conversations continued, and laughter echoed across the water. No one realized that something extraordinary had happened, that a young man who had just called his mother to say he was coming home would never be seen alive again. Sunday morning, September 15th, dawned like any other in Hampton. The sun rose over the cornfields, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of the small town. For most residents, it was a day for church services, family dinners, and the slow, peaceful rhythm that defines Sundays in rural Iowa. But for Ethan's family, the morning brought a growing sense of unease that would soon explode into full-blown panic. When Ethan didn't return home Saturday night, his family initially wasn't overly concerned. He was 22 years old, after all, and it wasn't unheard of for young adults to crash at a friend's house after a late night out. Maybe he had decided to stay over rather than drive home late at night, a responsible decision that parents might actually prefer. But as Sunday morning stretched into afternoon with no word from Ethan, concern began to creep in. Phone calls to friends yielded no answers. No one had seen Ethan since the party at the gravel pit. He hadn't mentioned plans to go anywhere else. Hadn't talked about meeting up with anyone after leaving the pond. His absence began to feel less like a minor miscommunication and more like something genuinely wrong. The decision to contact law enforcement wasn't made lightly. In small towns, families often hesitate to involve police in what might simply be a misunderstanding. There's always the worry about overreacting, about creating drama where none exists. But as the hours passed without any contact from Ethan, his family knew they needed help. When the Hampton Police Department received the missing person report for Ethan Kazmierzak, they began with the standard procedures that govern such cases. They gathered basic information: what he was wearing, where he was last seen, who he was with, what his normal patterns and behaviors were. The details painted a picture of a responsible young man who maintained regular contact with his family and had no history of simply disappearing without notice. The investigation quickly focused on the party at the gravel pit pond. Officers interviewed the other attendees, trying to piece together a timeline of who was there, when they arrived and left, and what they remembered about Ethan's time at the gathering. The interviews revealed the basic facts. Ethan had been at the party, he had seemed normal, and he had left around midnight after calling his mother. But there was one crucial detail that made this disappearance particularly puzzling. Ethan's car was missing too. His silver 2006 Volkswagen Jetta had vanished along with him, which suggested that he had indeed left the party on his own, just as he had told his mother he planned to do. If something had happened to Ethan at the party location, his car would presumably still be there. The fact that both Ethan and his vehicle had disappeared indicated that whatever occurred had happened somewhere else, somewhere along the route between the gravel pit and his home. What followed was the kind of comprehensive search effort that small communities are capable of mobilizing when one of their own goes missing. Hampton might be a small town, but it's the kind of place where neighbors look out for each other, where a crisis brings people together rather than driving them apart. The official search involved multiple law enforcement agencies. The Hampton Police Department took the lead, but they were soon joined by the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Search and rescue teams scoured the area between the gravel pit and Ethan's home, looking for any sign of his silver Volkswagen Jetta or any indication of what might have happened to him. The route from the party location to Ethan's home wasn't particularly long or complicated, but it did involve rural roads that could be treacherous at night, especially for someone who might have been drinking or was simply tired after a long evening. Investigators paid particular attention to ditches, culverts, and any areas where a car might have gone off the road and become hidden from casual view. Volunteers joined the effort, organizing their own search parties and covering areas that law enforcement might not have the resources to thoroughly examine. In small towns like Hampton, when tragedy strikes, the entire community responds. People took time off work, organized food for the searchers, and spread the word through social media and local networks. The search expanded beyond the immediate area as investigators considered other possibilities. Had Ethan decided to drive somewhere else after leaving the party? Had he planned to meet someone? The investigation traced his movements through the bars he had visited earlier in the evening, looking for anyone who might have heard him mention additional plans or who might have observed him interacting with someone who could provide clues. But despite extensive efforts, both official and volunteer, the searches yielded nothing. No trace of Ethan's car was found along the rural roads. No skid marks or signs of an accident were discovered. No witnesses came forward to report seeing a silver Volkswagen Jetta in the early morning hours of September 15th. It was as if Ethan and his car had simply vanished into the Iowa night. The investigation extended to Ethan's personal life, looking for any indication of problems that might have motivated him to disappear voluntarily. Investigators examined his financial records, his relationships, his mental health, and his recent activities. What they found was a young man with strong community ties, no significant debts or legal problems, and no history of mental health issues that would suggest suicidal ideation. As days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Ethan K. Merzak became a defining event for Hampton. Missing person flyers with his photograph appeared in store windows, on telephone poles, and in the lobbies of public buildings. His image became a familiar sight throughout the area, a young man with dark blonde hair and a beard, smiling in the way that suggested a life full of promise and possibility. The family established a website, findathin.com, which became a central hub for information about the case and a place where people could share tips or memories. Social media campaigns spread his story far beyond the borders of Iowa, as people shared his photograph and details about his disappearance in the hope that someone, somewhere, might have information that could help solve the mystery. Local businesses displayed missing person posters, and community members organized fundraisers to support the ongoing search efforts. The Windsor Theater, where Ethan had volunteered and which held such significance for his family's history, became an unofficial gathering place for people who wanted to show their support and share their memories of a young man who had touched many lives. The Hampton United Methodist Church, where Ethan had been a member, held prayer services and provided spiritual support for his family during the darkest hours of uncertainty. In a community where faith plays a central role in many people's lives, the church became a source of comfort and hope, even as the weeks passed without any breaks in the case. But perhaps most remarkably, the search efforts never truly stopped. Even as the official investigation continued with periodic updates and new approaches, volunteers maintained their own efforts. Weekend search parties became a regular occurrence, with community members systematically covering areas that had been searched before, understanding that sometimes the key to solving a mystery lies in looking at familiar places with fresh eyes. As 2013 became 2014, and then 2015, the case of Ethan Merzak joined the ranks of Iowa's cold cases. But unlike some missing person cases that fade from public attention, Ethan's story remained alive in the consciousness of his community and far beyond. The mystery of what happened to a young man who simply tried to drive home from a party continued to haunt investigators and family members alike. Annual remembrance events marked the anniversary of his disappearance. September 15th became a day of renewed hope and renewed determination to find answers. Local media regularly revisited the case, interviewing family members, law enforcement officials, and community members who refused to give up hope that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. The investigation never officially closed, but it did go through periods of reduced activity as new leads proved to be dead ends and fresh approaches failed to yield breakthrough information. Investigators periodically revisited the case file, re-interviewed witnesses, and explored new technologies that might be applied to the evidence they had gathered. Advanced cell phone tracking technology was applied to Ethan's phone records, but the rural nature of the area and the limited cell tower coverage in 2013 meant that precise location data wasn't available. The investigation into his financial records continued to show no activity after his disappearance, which strengthened the belief that something had happened to him, rather than his having left voluntarily. Family members became advocates, not just for finding Ethan, but for raising awareness about missing person cases in general. They learned to navigate the complex world of missing person investigations, building relationships with other families facing similar tragedies and sharing resources and strategies for keeping cases active in the public eye. The emotional toll on Ethan's family was immense. The uncertainty of not knowing what happened, the constant hope that today might bring the phone call that would provide answers, the effort required to keep his case in the public consciousness. All of this took a tremendous toll on people who were trying to process grief without even knowing for certain that they should be grieving. By 2020, 7 years had passed since Ethan's disappearance, and while his case remained open, the trail had long since gone cold. But sometimes, cold cases benefit from new approaches, new technology, and fresh perspectives. That's exactly what happened when a specialized underwater search and recovery team called Adventures with Purpose became involved in the case. Adventures with Purpose, based in Oregon, had built a reputation for using advanced sonar technology and skilled diving techniques to locate vehicles and human remains in bodies of water. Led by divers Jared Kask and Sam Ginn, the team had successfully solved numerous cold cases across the country by focusing on one simple premise: many missing person cases involving vehicles end with those vehicles submerged in water, often in locations that haven't been thoroughly searched or where previous search efforts had been inadequate. The team's approach was methodical and scientific. They used side-scan sonar technology to create detailed images of underwater terrain, identifying anomalies that might indicate the presence of submerged vehicles. Their success rate was impressive, and their work had brought closure to dozens of families who had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones. When Adventures with Purpose decided to travel to Iowa as part of a 45-day cross-country trip focused on cold cases, Ethan's disappearance was on their list. The team understood that in rural areas like Hampton, there are numerous ponds, quarries, and water-filled gravel pits that might hide the answers to long-standing mysteries. The decision to search water bodies in the Hampton area wasn't random. The investigation had always noted that Ethan was last seen at a party near a gravel pit pond, and the geography of the area included multiple water bodies that could potentially conceal a submerged vehicle. Previous searches had focused primarily on roads and ditches, operating under the assumption that if Ethan had been in an accident, it would have occurred along his route home. But Adventures with Purpose approached the case from a different angle. They considered the possibility that Ethan's vehicle might have ended up in water, either through an accident that occurred near a water body or through some other circumstance that had resulted in his car becoming submerged. The call came on a crisp October day in 2020, exactly 7 years after Ethan had disappeared. The sonar had detected something in a pond northwest of Hampton, near Olive Avenue, an area that was disturbingly close to where Ethan had last been seen. The shape on the sonar screen was unmistakably that of a vehicle, sitting upright on the bottom of the pond, hidden beneath years of murky water and accumulated sediments. The location of the discovery was particularly significant. The pond was near the intersection of 90th Street and Olive Avenue, an area that was consistent with Ethan's last known location and the route he might have taken from the party. It was the kind of location that, in retrospect, seemed obvious, but had somehow been overlooked during the extensive searches that had taken place in the years following his disappearance. The recovery operation required careful coordination between Adventures with Purpose, local law enforcement, and emergency services. Extracting a vehicle that had been submerged for 7 years was a delicate process that required specialized equipment and expertise. The pond's depth and the condition of the vehicle had to be carefully assessed before any recovery attempt could be made. When the silver 2006 Volkswagen Jetta was finally lifted from the water, there was no doubt about its identity. The license plate confirmed what everyone already knew. This was Ethan's car, the vehicle that had vanished with him on that September night 7 years earlier. But the discovery that would change everything came when investigators looked inside the vehicle. Human remains were found inside the car, remains that would later be identified through forensic analysis as those of Ethan Kazmierzak. After 7 years of searching, wondering, and hoping, his family finally had the answer to the most basic question that had haunted them. What had happened to their son, their brother, their friend? The discovery brought a mixture of profound grief and overwhelming relief. The uncertainty that had defined 7 years of their lives was finally over, but it was replaced by the devastating confirmation that Ethan had been gone all along, that he had died on the night he tried to drive home from a party, just 22 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. The recovery of Ethan's remains and his vehicle marked the beginning of a new phase of investigation. The Franklin County Sheriff's Office, led by Sheriff Aaron Dodd, took charge of the forensic examination of both the vehicle and the human remains, working in cooperation with the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office to determine the circumstances of Ethan's death. The condition of the vehicle after 7 years underwater provided crucial evidence about what might have happened on that September night, and forensic investigators examined the car for any signs of mechanical failure, impact damage, or other evidence that might explain how it ended up in the pond. The position of the vehicle on the bottom of the pond, the condition of the windows and doors, and the location of the remains inside the car all provided pieces of the puzzle. The examination revealed no obvious signs of foul play. There were no bullet holes, no evidence of explosion or fire, no indication that the vehicle had been tampered with before entering the water. The car appeared to have gone into the pond intact and had sunk to the bottom, where it had remained undisturbed for 7 years. The human remains were in a condition consistent with having been submerged for an extended period. The Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office conducted a thorough analysis, using dental records and other identifying characteristics to confirm that the remains were indeed those of Ethan Kazmierzak. The identification process was complicated by the condition of the remains after 7 years underwater, but forensic science provided the definitive answers that the family needed. Determining the exact cause of death proved more challenging. After 7 years in water, many of the traditional forensic indicators that might reveal the cause of death were no longer available for examination. The medical examiner's investigation focused on what evidence was available, but the passage of time and the environment in which the remains were found limited the conclusions that could be drawn. What the investigation could determine was the approximate time of death, which was consistent with Ethan's disappearance in September. The forensic evidence supported the conclusion that he had died shortly after his last contact with family and friends, which meant that he had been in the pond for the entire 7 years that people had been searching for him. With Ethan's car and remains recovered, investigators worked to reconstruct the events of that fateful September night. The location where the vehicle was found provided crucial clues about Ethan's movements after he left a party at the gravel pit pond. The pond near Olive Avenue was not directly on the most obvious route from the party location to Ethan's home, which raised questions about why he might have been in that area. Several theories emerged to explain how Ethan's car might have ended up in the water. The most straightforward explanation was that it had been a tragic accident, that Ethan, possibly disoriented by darkness, unfamiliar roads, or impairment from alcohol, had somehow driven into the pond without realizing the danger until it was too late. The rural roads around Hampton can be challenging to navigate at night, especially for someone who might not be completely familiar with every twist and turn. The pond where Ethan's car was found was not immediately visible from the road, and it's possible that he could have become confused about his location or the direction he was traveling. Another possibility was that Ethan had intentionally driven to the area near Olive Avenue for reasons that remain unknown. Perhaps he had planned to meet someone there, or maybe he had remembered something he needed to do before going home. The investigation found no evidence to support these theories, but they remained possibilities given the location of the discovery. Weather conditions on the night of September 14-15, 2013 were reviewed to determine if they might have contributed to an accident. While the night was not particularly stormy or unusual, visibility could have been limited, and road conditions might have been more challenging than they appeared during daylight hours. The investigation also considered the possibility that Ethan had experienced some kind of medical emergency while driving, which could have caused him to lose control of his vehicle. However, with limited forensic evidence available after 7 years, determining whether a medical event had occurred was not possible. The discovery of Ethan's remains brought a measure of closure to a community that had lived with uncertainty for 7 years. While the news was devastating for those who had held on to hope that he might still be alive, it also provided answers to questions that had haunted Hampton since. The Hampton United Methodist Church held a memorial service that drew hundreds of people from throughout the region. The service was both a celebration of Ethan's life and a recognition of the community's collective journey through 7 years of uncertainty. Pastor and congregation members spoke about Ethan's contributions to the church and the broader community, his love of music, and his commitment to preserving the cultural heritage represented by the Windsor Theater. The memorial service also served as a form of communal healing. For 7 years, the community had lived with the weight of not knowing what had happened to one of their own. The discovery of his remains allowed people to begin the process of true grief and mourning, which had been impossible while his fate remained unknown. Family members spoke publicly about their gratitude to Adventures with Purpose and the many volunteers who had never given up searching for Ethan. They expressed appreciation for the law enforcement officers who had continued to work on the case even as years passed without new developments. Most importantly, they thanked the community members who had kept Ethan's memory alive and had refused to let his case fade into obscurity. The Windsor Theater held a special memorial concert featuring local musicians who performed some of Ethan's favorite pieces. The event was both a tribute to his memory and a celebration of the musical heritage that had been so important to him. Musicians who had known Ethan spoke about his talent, his enthusiasm for music, and his commitment to sharing the joy of musical performance with others. Local media coverage of the discovery and the subsequent memorial events provided an opportunity for the community to reflect on the impact that Ethan's disappearance had on Hampton. Interviews with family members, friends, and law enforcement officials revealed the depth of the commitment that people had made to finding answers and supporting the family during their years of uncertainty. While the discovery of Ethan's remains answered the fundamental question of what had happened to him, many details about that September night in 2013 remain unclear. The exact sequence of events that led to his car ending up in the pond may never be fully understood, and the investigation into his death continues as authorities work to piece together as complete a picture as possible. Sheriff Aaron Dodd emphasized that, while the recovery was a significant breakthrough, the investigation was not closed. Law enforcement officials continued to examine evidence from the vehicle and to interview anyone who might have additional information about Ethan's activities on the night he disappeared. The forensic examination of the vehicle continued for months after its recovery, as investigators looked for any clues that might explain how it ended up in the pond. The car's mechanical systems were examined to determine if any failures might have contributed to the accidents. The vehicle's electronics were analyzed to see if any data could be recovered that might provide information about its final journey. Investigators also continued to explore the possibility that additional witnesses might come forward with information about that night. Sometimes the recovery of remains and the renewed media attention that accompanies such discoveries prompts people to share information they might have been reluctant to disclose earlier. The investigation considered whether Ethan might have been with someone else on the night he disappeared, and whether that person might have survived and been reluctant to come forward due to legal concerns or other factors. However, no evidence was found to support the presence of another person in the vehicle or at the scene. Questions also remained about why the pond where Ethan's car was found had not been searched more thoroughly during the initial investigation. The location was relatively close to where he was last seen, and it was in an area that would have been consistent with possible routes he might have taken. However, the rural area around Hampton includes numerous water bodies, and it would have been impossible to search every pond, creek, and water-filled quarry without specific reasons to focus on particular locations. The successful resolution of Ethan's case highlighted the important role that advancing technology can play in solving cold cases. The sonar equipment used by Adventures with Purpose was significantly more advanced than what had been available to local law enforcement in 2013, and their specialized expertise in underwater searches provided capabilities that hadn't been accessible during the initial investigation. The case also demonstrated how social media and internet resources could help keep missing person cases in the public consciousness. The Find a Thing and a Calm website, Facebook pages dedicated to his case, and social media sharing had helped ensure that his story reached a much wider audience than would have been possible through traditional media alone. Law enforcement agencies throughout Iowa and the broader Midwest took note of the techniques and technologies that had led to Ethan's discovery. Many agencies began to reconsider their approaches to missing person cases, particularly those involving vehicles that might have ended up in water. The success of Adventures with Purpose and Ethan's case also led to increased cooperation between the volunteer search organization and law enforcement agencies working on similar cold cases. Their specialized skills and equipment complemented the resources available to local law enforcement and provided new options for investigating cases that had reached dead ends. The case prompted discussions about how missing person investigations might be enhanced through better coordination between different types of search resources. While traditional ground searches and road-based investigations remain important, Ethan's case demonstrated that water-based searches should be a standard component of comprehensive missing person investigations, particularly in areas where water bodies are common. The 7-year mystery of Ethan Kosmerzak's disappearance and the eventual discovery of his remains provided important lessons for families, law enforcement agencies, and communities dealing with missing person cases. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the value of persistence and the importance of never giving up hope that answers can be found, even years after a disappearance occurs. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the importance of considering all possibilities when investigating missing person cases, including scenarios that might seem less likely at the time but could provide crucial insights years later. The discovery of Ethan's car in a pond that was relatively close to where he was last seen suggested that water-based searches should be given greater priority in rural missing person cases. The case also demonstrated the value of collaboration between different types of search and rescue organizations. The specialized skills and equipment provided by Adventures with Purpose complemented the work that had been done by local law enforcement and volunteer searchers, ultimately providing the breakthrough that solved the case. For families dealing with missing person cases, Ethan's story provided both hope and practical guidance. The persistence of his family in keeping his case active, their use of social media and internet resources to maintain public awareness, and their cooperation with various search organizations all contributed to the eventual resolution of the case. The community response to Ethan's disappearance also provided a model for how small towns can mobilize to support families and maintain long-term search efforts. The sustained involvement of volunteers, local businesses, and community organizations helped ensure that the case remained active in public consciousness and that resources were available to support ongoing search efforts. Throughout the 7 years between Ethan's disappearance and the discovery of his remains, his family experienced a journey through grief, hope, despair, and ultimately acceptance that few people can truly understand. The uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their loved one created a unique form of suffering that was compounded by the constant hope that answers might be just around the corner. Family members became experts in missing person investigations, learning about search techniques, legal procedures, and the various resources available to families dealing with such cases. They built relationships with other families facing similar situations, providing mutual support and sharing strategies for coping with the unique challenges of having a missing loved one. The financial and emotional costs of maintaining a long-term search effort were substantial. In addition to the basic expenses of everyday life, the family invested significant resources in search efforts, reward funds, and awareness campaigns. The emotional energy required to maintain hope while preparing for the worst possible outcomes took a tremendous toll on everyone involved. The discovery of Ethan's remains, while providing answers, also marked the beginning of a new phase of grief. After 7 years of hoping he might still be alive, the family had to confront the reality of his death and begin the process of true mourning. In some ways, the confirmation of his death was almost as difficult to process as his initial disappearance had been. But the family also expressed gratitude for the closure that the discovery provided. After years of uncertainty, they finally had answers to the basic questions about what had happened to Ethan. They could lay him to rest properly, hold appropriate memorial services, and begin to heal from wounds that had been kept open by uncertainty. Ethan's case had implications that extended far beyond Hampton, Iowa. His story became part of a growing awareness of the challenges involved in missing person investigations and the importance of using all available resources and technologies to solve such cases. The success of Adventures with Purpose in solving Ethan's case led to increased recognition of their work, and similar organizations around the country. Their approach of using advanced sonar technology to search water bodies for missing vehicles inspired law enforcement agencies to consider new approaches to cold cases and missing person investigations. The case also contributed to discussions about how social media and internet resources could be more effectively utilized in missing person investigations. The sustained online presence maintained by Ethan's family and supporters demonstrated how digital platforms could help keep cases active in public consciousness and potentially reach witnesses or individuals with relevant information. Law enforcement training programs began to incorporate lessons learned from cases like Ethan's, emphasizing the importance of considering all possible scenarios in missing person investigations and the value of maintaining long-term relationships with specialized search organizations and volunteer groups. The case also highlighted the importance of community support for families dealing with missing person situations. The sustained involvement of Hampton residents in search efforts and awareness campaigns provided a model for how communities could effectively support families while contributing to investigative efforts. As the immediate aftermath of the discovery began to settle into a new normal, the focus shifted from searching for answers to preserving Ethan's memory and honoring the impact he had on his community. The young man who had disappeared at age 22 had touched many lives during his brief time in Hampton, and those connections remained strong even after his death. The Windsor Theater, which had been so important to Ethan and his family's history, established a memorial fund in his honor. The fund supported local arts programs and helped ensure that young people in the Hampton area would have opportunities to explore their own musical and artistic interests, just as Ethan had done. The Hampton United Methodist Church created a memorial garden where community members could come to remember Ethan and reflect on the impact that his life and disappearance had on their community. The garden became a place of quiet reflection where people could process their own experiences with loss and uncertainty while honoring the memory of a young man who had been taken too soon. Local musicians continued to perform pieces that Ethan had enjoyed, keeping his musical spirit alive in the community that had nurtured his talents. Annual memorial concerts became a tradition, bringing together performers and audiences who wanted to celebrate the artistic legacy that he had begun to build during his brief life. The story of Ethan's disappearance and eventual discovery also became part of Hampton's collective memory, a reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to cherish the time we have with the people we love. Parents hugged their children a little tighter, friends made sure to stay in closer contact, and the community as a whole developed a deeper appreciation for the bonds that connect people to each other. The technological breakthrough that led to Ethan's discovery represented more than just the resolution of one case. It symbolized the ongoing evolution of forensic science and search technologies that continue to provide new hope for families dealing with missing person cases. The sonar equipment used by Adventures with Purpose was just one example of how advancing technology could breathe new life into cold cases that had seemed unsolvable. The success in Ethan's case encouraged other families to consider water-based searches in their own situations, particularly in rural areas where bodies of water are common but may not have been thoroughly searched during initial investigations. The specialized techniques and equipment required for underwater searches had simply not been widely available to local law enforcement agencies in many areas, but organizations like Adventures with Purpose were helping to fill that gap. The case also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary approaches to missing person investigations. The combination of traditional law enforcement techniques, advanced technology, volunteer search efforts, and sustained community support had ultimately led to the breakthrough that solved Ethan's case. This collaborative model provided a template for how similar cases might be approached in the future. Forensic science continued to evolve in ways that could benefit cold case investigations. DNA analysis techniques that hadn't been available in 2013 offered new possibilities for analyzing evidence that had been collected but not fully examined. Digital forensics provided new ways to analyze cell phone data, social media activity, and other electronic evidence that might contain clues about missing persons. The growing network of families dealing with missing person cases also provided new resources for sharing information and strategies. Online communities and support groups allowed families to learn from each other's experiences and to coordinate efforts that might help solve multiple cases simultaneously. Even with Ethan's remains recovered and his identity confirmed, some aspects of his case continued to generate questions and speculation. The exact circumstances that led to his car ending up in the pond remained unclear, and investigators acknowledged that some details might never be fully understood. The route that Ethan took after leaving the party at the gravel pit pond was still a matter of investigation. The location where his car was found was not on the most direct path to his home, which suggested that he had either become disoriented or had intentionally traveled to that area for reasons that remained unknown. The investigation also continued to explore whether Ethan had been in contact with anyone else after his phone call to his mother at 12:50. Cell phone records from 2013 were limited compared to what would be available today, but investigators worked with telecommunications companies to extract any additional data that might shed light on his final movements. Weather and road conditions on the night of his disappearance were thoroughly analyzed to determine if they might have contributed to an accident. While the night was not particularly hazardous, investigators wanted to understand every factor that might have influenced the events that led to Ethan's death. The possibility that Ethan had experienced a medical emergency while driving remained under consideration. Heart conditions, seizures, or other medical events could potentially cause a young, healthy person to lose control of a vehicle. However, determining whether such an event had occurred was challenging given the condition of the remains after 7 years in water. Investigators also continued to examine whether there might have been mechanical problems with Ethan's vehicle that could have contributed to the accident. The 2006 Volkswagen Jetta was examined for any signs of brake failure, steering problems, or other mechanical issues that might have caused him to lose control of the car. The resolution of Ethan's case had effects that rippled far beyond Hampton, Iowa. Other families dealing with missing person cases took note of the techniques and persistence that had led to the breakthrough, and many began to reconsider their own approaches to searching for answers. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest and beyond began to evaluate their own cold cases, particularly those involving missing persons and vehicles that might have ended up in water. The success of Adventures with Purpose inspired increased cooperation between law enforcement and specialized volunteer search organizations. The case also contributed to growing awareness of the unique challenges faced by families dealing with missing person situations. The 7-year journey that Ethan's family had endured highlighted the need for better support systems and resources for families caught in similar circumstances. Insurance companies and legal systems also took note of cases like Ethan's, which involved situations where a person's fate remained unknown for extended periods. The challenges of dealing with financial and legal matters when someone is missing but not confirmed dead created unique complications that required careful consideration. Mental health professionals working with families of missing persons gained new insights from cases like Ethan's about the unique form of grief and trauma experienced by people who must live with uncertainty about their loved one's fate. The concept of ambiguous loss became more widely understood as communities grappled with the psychological impact of unsolved disappearances. The successful resolution of Ethan's case provided valuable lessons for law enforcement agencies dealing with missing person investigations. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the value of maintaining open minds about all possible scenarios, even those that might seem less likely during the initial stages of an investigation. The case also highlighted the importance of water-based searches in missing person investigations, particularly in rural areas where bodies of water are common. Many agencies began to develop better relationships with organizations capable of conducting underwater searches and to incorporate such searches into their standard missing person protocols. The sustained nature of the search efforts in Ethan's case also demonstrated the value of maintaining long-term relationships with volunteer search organizations and community groups. The volunteers who continued to search for Ethan years after his disappearance played a crucial role in keeping his case active and ultimately contributed to its resolution. The case provided insights into the challenges of searching rural areas with limited resources. Small-town law enforcement agencies often lack the specialized equipment and expertise needed for comprehensive searches of large geographic areas, particularly those involving water bodies or difficult terrain. Communication and coordination between different agencies and organizations also proved crucial to the case's resolution. The successful outcome required cooperation between local law enforcement, state agencies, volunteer organizations, and specialized search teams working together toward a common goal. Throughout the 7 years of uncertainty and the eventual resolution of Ethan's case, the Hampton community demonstrated the remarkable power of collective action and sustained commitment. The search efforts, awareness campaigns, and ongoing support for Ethan's family showed how small communities could mobilize effectively when facing tragedy. The volunteers who participated in search efforts over the years represented every segment of the Hampton community. Farmers left their fields to help search ditches and rural roads. Business owners closed their shops to join organized search parties. Students and elderly residents worked side by side, united in their determination to find answers. Local churches provided not only spiritual support but also practical assistance, organizing meals for searchers, providing meeting spaces for planning sessions, and offering counseling services for those struggling with the uncertainty and trauma of the situation. The business community played a crucial role by displaying missing person flyers, supporting fundraising efforts, and providing resources for search activities. The sustained nature of this support, continuing for years rather than just weeks or months, demonstrated the depth of the community's commitment to finding Ethan. Social media and online communities allowed the search efforts to extend far beyond Hampton's geographic boundaries. People who had never met Ethan or his family shared his story, posted his photograph, and kept his case active in online discussions about missing persons. The educational impact of Ethan's case was also significant. Community members learned about missing person investigations, search techniques, and the resources available to families facing similar situations. This knowledge would prove valuable if the community ever faced similar circumstances in the future. The discovery of Ethan's remains fundamentally changed how his case was understood, but it also raised new questions about missing person investigations more broadly. The fact that he had been relatively close to his last known location for the entire 7 years of searching highlighted how challenging it could be to locate missing persons even when extensive search efforts were undertaken. The case demonstrated that even with dedicated volunteers, professional law enforcement, and sustained community effort, missing persons could remain undiscovered for extended periods. This reality was sobering for other families dealing with similar situations, but it also provided hope that answers could still be found even after years had passed. The role of specialized search organizations like Adventures with Purpose became more widely recognized as a crucial component of comprehensive missing person investigations. Their equipment, expertise, and dedication to cold cases provided capabilities that complemented traditional law enforcement resources. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed records and evidence throughout long-term investigations. Information that seemed irrelevant in 2013 proved crucial in 2020, demonstrating the value of thorough documentation and evidence preservation. The emotional journey that Ethan's family experienced provided insights into the unique challenges faced by families of missing persons. Their persistence, advocacy efforts, and use of various resources to keep the case active served as a model for other families facing similar circumstances. As Hampton began to process the resolution of Ethan's case, the community faced the challenge of moving forward while honoring his memory and the lessons learned from his disappearance. The 7 years of uncertainty had changed the town in fundamental ways, creating bonds between people who had worked together in search efforts and raising awareness about issues that many had never considered before. The memorial services and tributes that followed the discovery of Ethan's remains provided opportunities for the community to celebrate his life while acknowledging the collective journey they had experienced together. These events served as both endings and beginnings, the conclusion of the search for answers and the start of a new phase of remembrance and healing. Local organizations began to consider how the lessons learned from Ethan's case could be applied to future situations. Emergency response protocols were reviewed and updated based on the experience gained during the long search effort. Community groups discussed how they could be better prepared to support families facing similar tragedies. The case also prompted discussions about rural safety and the unique challenges faced by young people in small towns. While Ethan's death appeared to have been accidental, his case raised awareness about the potential dangers of driving on rural roads at night and the importance of safety planning for social gatherings. Educational initiatives emerged from the case, including programs designed to teach young people about personal safety and to help families understand the resources available if a loved one goes missing. These programs honored Ethan's memory while working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. While the discovery of Ethan's remains answered the fundamental question of what had happened to him, the official investigation continued as authorities worked to understand the exact circumstances of his death. The forensic examination of both the vehicle and the remains required careful analysis and consultation with specialists in various fields. The Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office conducted a thorough examination of the remains, working to determine not only the cause of death, but also any factors that might have contributed to the accidents. The advanced state of decomposition after 7 years in water made this analysis challenging, but forensic experts used all available techniques to extract as much information as possible. The vehicle examination focused on identifying any mechanical problems that might have caused or contributed to the accidents. Brake systems, steering components, and other critical safety systems were carefully analyzed to determine their condition at the time of the accidents. Environmental factors were also studied, including water conditions in the pond, visibility on the night of the accident, and road conditions that might have affected Ethan's driving. Weather records from September 14-15, 2013 were reviewed to understand all potential contributing factors. The investigation also continued to explore Ethan's activities and mental state on the night of his disappearance. Interviews with friends and family members who had been with him that evening were reviewed for any details that might provide insights into his intentions or state of mind. The resolution of Ethan's case positioned his family as advocates and resources for other families dealing with missing person situations. Their experience navigating the complex world of missing person investigations, maintaining hope during years of uncertainty, and working with various law enforcement and volunteer organizations gave them unique insights that could benefit others. Ethan's family began participating in missing person awareness events and conferences, sharing their story and the lessons they had learned during their 7-year journey. They emphasized the importance of persistence, the value of working with multiple search organizations, and the crucial role of community support in sustaining long-term search efforts. The family also worked to raise awareness about the resources available to families of missing persons, including specialized search organizations, support groups, and legal assistance programs. They understood firsthand how overwhelming it could be to navigate these resources while dealing with the emotional trauma of having a missing loved one. Their advocacy efforts included working with law enforcement agencies to improve missing person investigation protocols, particularly regarding water-based searches and long-term case management. They shared their experience of what had worked well and what could have been done differently during their own case. The establishment of memorial funds and awareness programs in Ethan's name provided ongoing ways for the community to honor his memory, while supporting efforts to help other families facing similar situations. These initiatives ensured that the lessons learned from his case would continue to benefit others long into the future. As time passed and the immediate intensity of the discovery began to fade into a new normal, the true legacy of Ethan Kazmierzak's case began to emerge. His story had become more than just a missing person case. It had become a testament to the power of community, the importance of persistence, and the potential for technology and human dedication to provide answers, even in the most challenging circumstances. The case had demonstrated that cold cases could be solved, that families should never give up hope, and that communities could make a real difference in supporting those facing unimaginable circumstances. These lessons extended far beyond Hampton, Iowa, inspiring families throughout the country who were dealing with their own missing person cases. The collaboration between Adventures with Purpose and local law enforcement that had led to Ethan's discovery became a model for how specialized volunteer organizations could work effectively with official investigations. This partnership approach was adopted by agencies in other states, leading to the resolution of additional cold cases. The sustained community response to Ethan's disappearance also provided a template for how small towns could mobilize effectively when facing tragedy. The combination of organized search efforts, awareness campaigns, volunteer coordination, and long-term support for affected families created a comprehensive approach that other communities could adapt to their own situation. The technological aspects of the case contributed to growing awareness of how advancing search and forensic technologies could breathe new life into cold cases. The success of sonar technology in locating Ethan's vehicle inspired increased investment in such equipment and training for law enforcement agencies. The pond near Olive Avenue, northwest of Hampton, looks much the same as it did on that September night in 2013 when Ethan Kazmierzak's car entered its dark waters. The rural roads still wind through Iowa farmland, past cornfields that cycle through seasons of planting, growth, and harvest. The small town of Hampton continues its quiet rhythm of daily life, where neighbors still know each other's names and community events still bring people together. But something fundamental changed in Hampton during those 7 years of searching and uncertainty. Something that continues to shape the community today. The experience of collectively facing an unsolvable mystery, of maintaining hope in the face of unanswered questions, and of ultimately finding resolution through persistence and advanced technology, created bonds and awareness that remain strong. Ethan's story has become part of Hampton's collective memory, a reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to cherish the time we have with the people we love. It's also a testament to the power of community action and the potential for even the most challenging mysteries to be solved when people refuse to give up. A young man who loved music and volunteered at the historic Windsor Theater, who called his mother to say he was coming home on a September night in 2013, has left a legacy that extends far beyond his 22 years of life. His story has brought closure to a family that waited 7 years for answers, has provided hope to other families facing similar circumstances, and has demonstrated the remarkable things that can happen when communities come together in support of those who need help. The silver 2006 Volkswagen Jetta that carried Ethan on his final journey has been examined by forensic experts and carefully documented as evidence. The pond that held his secrets for 7 years has given up its answers, and the community that never stopped searching for him has found a measure of peace in knowing that he has finally come home. In the end, Ethan Kazmierzak's story is both tragic and inspiring, a reminder of life's fragility and uncertainty, but also a testament to the enduring power of love, community, and the human refusal to accept that some questions can never be answered. His disappearance became a mystery that haunted a small Iowa town for 7 years. But his discovery became a source of hope that even the most challenging cases can be solved when the right combination of technology, dedication, and community support comes together. The search for Ethan is over, but the lessons learned from his case continue to ripple outward, providing guidance and inspiration for families, law enforcement agencies, and communities facing their own unsolved mysteries. In that ongoing impact, the young man who simply tried to drive home from a party on a September night continues to make a difference in the world, ensuring that his brief life and the long search that followed will not be forgotten. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 4. The autumn air was crisp in Crevcoeur, Missouri on November 11, 2019. In the quiet suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns met tree-lined streets, Jennifer Rothwell prepared for what would be her final workday. At 28 years old, Jennifer was the embodiment of the American dream realized through hard work and determination. She held a prestigious position as a chemical engineer, a field where her analytical mind and attention to detail served her well. Her colleagues knew her as methodical, intelligent, and kind, someone who could solve complex problems with the same gentle patience she showed to everyone around her. That Monday evening, Jennifer carried with her a secret that filled her with both joy and trepidation. She was 6 weeks pregnant. For many couples, this would be cause for celebration. But Jennifer's internet search history from the days leading up to her death would later reveal a heartbreaking truth that chilled investigators to the bone. In the privacy of her own home, Jennifer had typed into her search bar, "What to do if your husband is upset you are pregnant?" The question would haunt everyone who learned of it. Here was a woman who should have been planning nurseries and baby names, instead researching how to handle her husband's potential anger about the life growing inside her. It spoke to a marriage that from the outside appeared picture perfect but concealed darker truths beneath its polished surface. Jennifer and Beau Rothwell had been together for 8 years, married for 4. To friends and family, they seemed like an ideal couple. Both were educated professionals. Jennifer with her engineering background, and Beau working in the business sector. They lived in a beautiful home in an upscale suburb of St. Louis, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other over pristine fences and children rode bicycles down quiet cul-de-sacs. Their social media presence painted the picture of a happy couple enjoying life together, taking vacations and building what appeared to be a solid foundation for their future. But behind closed doors, their marriage was fracturing in ways that Jennifer was only beginning to understand. Beau had been having an affair with another woman, a betrayal that would prove to be the catalyst for the tragedy that was about to unfold. What Jennifer didn't know as she went about her daily routine that November was that her husband had been living a double life, one that would soon make her pregnancy announcement not a moment of joy, but a complication he was unwilling to accept. The morning of November 11th began like any other. Jennifer followed her usual routine, coffee, a quick check of her phone, preparing for another day at work. She was the type of person who approached each day with purpose, someone who believed in the power of planning and preparation. Her friends would later describe her as someone who lit up a room, whose laugh was infectious, and whose kindness extended to everyone she met. She was excited about the future, about the possibility of starting a family, about the next chapter of her life with the man she thought she knew. But Beau Rothwell was harboring secrets that would shatter any hope of that future. In the weeks leading up to that fateful day, he had been engaged in an affair that consumed his thoughts and divided his loyalties. While Jennifer was discovering she was pregnant and grappling with how to share this news with her husband, Beau was exchanging text messages with another woman, messages that painted a picture of a man who felt trapped in his marriage and was actively planning his escape. The evidence that would later emerge in court proceedings revealed a man who was methodical in his deception. Prosecutors would argue that Beau Rothwell was not just an unfaithful husband, but someone who had been carefully considering his options for leaving his marriage. They discovered that he had actually created a pros and cons list about divorcing Jennifer, a chilling document that treated the end of their marriage like a business decision to be analyzed and optimized. On that list, Beau had written out the benefits of leaving his wife alongside the potential drawbacks. It was a cold, calculating approach to what should have been one of the most emotionally charged decisions of his life. The list revealed a man who had already emotionally detached himself from his marriage, who saw Jennifer not as a partner and companion, but as an obstacle to his desired future. When Jennifer came home from work that evening, she was carrying the weight of her secret and the hope that sharing her pregnancy news might bring them closer together. Perhaps she imagined that a baby might be the thing that saved their marriage, that it would remind Beau of the love they had once shared, and the future they had planned together. She had no way of knowing that her husband had already made his decision about their relationship, and that her pregnancy announcement would be seen not as a gift, but as a complication to his carefully laid plans. The conversation that followed would be the last one Jennifer Rothwell would ever have. According to Beau's own later testimony, Jennifer shared her pregnancy news, and what should have been a moment of celebration became the spark that ignited his rage. He would later claim that they argued about his affair, that the discussion became heated, and that in a moment of anger he struck her. But the evidence would tell a different story. The prosecution would argue that this was not a crime of passion, not a moment of temporary insanity, but rather the calculated act of a man who saw murder as the solution to his marital problems. The physical evidence found at the scene would support this theory, painting a picture of deliberate action rather than spontaneous violence. Beau's account of what happened next was both chilling and revealing. He claimed that during their argument he hit Jennifer, and that she fell down the stairs. But the evidence suggested something far more brutal. Jennifer had suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries to her head. The weapon used was a mallet, and the force required to inflict her injuries spoke to a sustained and vicious attack, not a single blow in the heat of the moment. The prosecution would later argue that Bo Rothwell beat his pregnant wife to death with a mallet, continuing to strike her until her skull cracked and she was unresponsive. It was an act of such violence that it was difficult for those who knew them to comprehend. This was not the man that Jennifer's family thought they knew, not the husband who had shared Christmas dinners and family vacations with them for nearly a decade. After Jennifer was dead, Bo faced the immediate problem of what to do with her body. This is where the evidence would later show his methodical, calculating nature. Rather than calling for help, rather than claiming it was an accident or turning himself in, Bo Rothwell began what prosecutors would describe as an elaborate cover-up, designed to conceal his crime and allow him to continue his life as if nothing had happened. First, he stripped Jennifer's body and wrapped her head in a plastic bag. Then he loaded her into his truck and drove approximately 45 minutes to a wooded area in Lincoln County, Missouri. There, along Highway 61, he dumped his wife's body in a secluded area, leaving her naked and exposed to the elements. It was a final act of degradation against a woman who had loved him and trusted him with her life. But Bo's work was far from finished. He returned home and began the process of cleaning up the crime scene. He removed the carpeting from the area where Jennifer had been killed, carpeting that was soaked with her blood. He then attempted to clean the remaining bloodstains with bleach, scrubbing frantically to remove any trace of what had happened. The carpet and padding were removed and disposed of, but Bo made a critical error. He replaced the old carpeting with new carpet, but he couldn't perfectly match the existing flooring. This discrepancy would later be noticed by investigators, providing them with crucial evidence of his attempts to cover up the crime. Bo also faced the challenge of explaining Jennifer's absence. She was scheduled to work the next day, and her failure to show up would quickly be noticed by her colleagues and supervisors. He needed to buy himself time to perfect his story and establish an alibi that would deflect suspicion away from him. On November 12, 2019, Bo Rothwell called the police to report his wife missing. His performance during this call would later be scrutinized by investigators, who noted discrepancies in his story and a lack of genuine emotion in his voice. He claimed that Jennifer had left for work as usual, but had never arrived. He suggested that she might have been in a car accident, or that something terrible had happened to her during her commute. The police response was immediate and thorough. Jennifer Rothwell was a respected member of the community, a professional woman with no history of disappearing or erratic behavior. When someone like Jennifer goes missing, it sets off alarm bells for law enforcement officers who understand that such disappearances are rarely voluntary. Bo played the role of the concerned husbands, speaking to media outlets and pleading for Jennifer's safe return. He appeared on local news stations, his face a mask of worry and desperation, begging for anyone with information to come forward. To those watching at home, he seemed like a loving husband desperate to find his missing wife. But investigators were already beginning to notice inconsistencies in his story. During their initial interview with Bo, they asked routine questions about Jennifer's habits, her mental state, and their relationship. Bo's answers were sometimes contradictory, and his emotional responses didn't always align with what they would expect from someone whose wife had genuinely disappeared. The first major break in the case came when investigators obtained a search warrant for the Rothwell home. What they discovered there would transform the missing person case into a homicide investigation. Despite Bo's attempts to clean the scene, forensic investigators found evidence that told the true story of what had happened in that house. The most damning evidence was the carpeting. While Bo had removed the blood-soaked carpet and padding from the area where Jennifer was killed, he had attempted to replace it with similar but not identical material. Investigators immediately noticed the discrepancy and realized that someone had recently attempted to replace flooring in the home. When they examined the new carpeting more closely, they found that it had been soaked with bleach in an attempt to destroy any biological evidence. But bleach, while effective at breaking down DNA, cannot completely eliminate all traces of blood, especially when that blood is soaked deep into carpet padding and subfloor materials. Forensic investigators used luminol, a chemical that glows blue when it comes into contact with iron found in blood, even in minute quantities. When they sprayed the luminol on the area where the carpet had been replaced, the room lit up like a Christmas tree. The pattern of blood spatter told a story of violence, of someone being struck repeatedly while they were on the ground. The discovery of the blood evidence was the moment when Bo Rothwell's carefully constructed story began to fall apart. No longer was this a case of a missing woman who might have been the victim of a random crime or accident. This was now a crime scene, and the evidence pointed directly to her husband as the perpetrator. But investigators still needed to find Jennifer's body to build a complete case. They knew she was likely dead based on the amount of blood found in the house, but without her remains, they couldn't definitively prove that a murder had taken place, much less build a case strong enough to secure a conviction. The search for Jennifer Rothwell's body became a massive undertaking involving multiple law enforcement agencies and hundreds of volunteers. They scoured the area around Crèvecoeur, looking in parks, wooded areas and along roadways. They dragged ponds and searched abandoned buildings. The entire community rallied around the efforts, with residents joining organized search parties and keeping an eye out for any sign of Jennifer. For Bo, the discovery of blood evidence in his home meant that his story needed to evolve. He could no longer maintain that Jennifer had simply left for work and disappeared. Faced with undeniable physical evidence, he would need to craft a new narrative that could explain away the blood while still maintaining his innocence. The pressure on Bo intensified when investigators discovered his affair. The existence of another woman provided a clear motive for wanting to be free of his marriage, and it painted his relationship with Jennifer in a very different light than the picture of marital bliss he had been presenting to the public. Text messages between Bo and his mistress revealed the depth of his deception and his desire to be free of his marriage. These messages, which would later be presented at trial, showed a man who was actively planning a future that didn't include Jennifer, even as he was coming home to her each night and maintaining the facade of their relationship. The affair also provided investigators with additional evidence about Bo's state of mind leading up to Jennifer's disappearance. His communications with the other woman showed that he was not a man devastated by his wife's disappearance, but rather someone who seemed to be preparing for a new chapter in his life. On November 20, 2019, 8 days after Jennifer was reported missing, her body was finally discovered. A passerby walking along Highway 61 in Lincoln County noticed something unusual in the brush alongside the road. As he investigated further, he saw what appeared to be human feet protruding from the vegetation. The location where Jennifer's body was found was approximately 45 minutes from her home in Crèvecoeur, in a secluded area that someone would need to know well or would have had to scout in advance. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, and scavenging animals had disturbed some of the remains. But it was clearly Jennifer Rothwell. The discovery of Jennifer's body provided investigators with the final piece of evidence they needed to arrest Bo Rothwell and charge him with her murder. She was found naked, with the plastic bag that had been placed over her head partially torn away by animals. The location and condition of the body supported the prosecution's theory that this was a premeditated murder, followed by an attempted cover-up. Medical examiner findings revealed the true extent of Jennifer's injuries. She had suffered multiple blunt force trauma wounds to her head, consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. The injuries were severe enough to crack her skull and cause massive internal bleeding. She had been 6 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. The arrest of Bo Rothwell sent shockwaves through the Crèvecoeur community and Jennifer's circle of friends and family. To many who knew them, the idea that Bo could have committed such a violent crime was almost incomprehensible. He had always presented himself as a mild-mannered, professional man who loved his wife and was looking forward to their future together. But as more details of the case emerged, a different picture of Bo Rothwell began to take shape. This was not a crime of passion committed by a man who temporarily lost control. Instead, investigators painted a picture of a methodical killer who had planned not just the murder, but the cover-up that followed. The evidence presented at trial would show that Bo had researched divorce proceedings and had even created that infamous pros and cons list about leaving Jennifer. This suggested that he had been contemplating the end of his marriage for some time, and that Jennifer's pregnancy announcement may have simply accelerated his timeline. Prosecutors would argue that when Jennifer announced her pregnancy, Bo realized that a divorce would now involve child support and shared custody, complications that would make it much more difficult for him to start fresh with his mistress. In his mind, they would argue murder became a more attractive option than divorce. The trial of Bo Rothwell began in April 2022, nearly 2.5 years after Jennifer's death. The case had garnered significant media attention, both because of the brutal nature of the crime and because of the tragic irony of Jennifer's internet searches before her death. The image of a pregnant woman researching how to handle her husband's anger about her pregnancy resonated with people across the country and highlighted the vulnerability that many women face in their own homes. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, building a timeline of events that painted Beau as a calculating killer who had planned and executed his wife's murder. They presented the physical evidence found at the crime scene, including the blood spatter patterns that told the story of a sustained and vicious attack. They also presented evidence of Beau's affair and his communications with his mistress, showing that he had been actively planning a future that didn't include Jennifer. The pros and cons list about divorce was presented as evidence of his state of mind, showing that he had been contemplating the end of his marriage and weighing his options. Perhaps most damaging to Beau's case was Jennifer's own internet search history. The searches she had made in the days before her death painted a picture of a woman who was afraid of her husband's reaction to her pregnancy. It suggested that she had reason to fear his anger, and that their marriage was not the happy union that Beau had portrayed to the outside world. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his attempts to cover up the crime had been thoroughly documented by investigators. Their strategy focused on trying to convince the jury that while Beau had indeed killed Jennifer, it had not been premeditated murder, but rather a crime of passion that should be charged as voluntary manslaughter. Beau himself took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that allowed prosecutors to cross-examine him about his actions and his story. His testimony provided insight into his version of events, but it also exposed him to aggressive questioning about the inconsistencies in his story and the evidence of premeditation. During his testimony, Beau admitted to killing Jennifer but maintained that it had not been planned. He claimed that their argument had escalated quickly and that he had struck her in a moment of anger. He testified that after hitting her, he realized she was badly injured and panicked, leading to his decision to dispose of her body and cover up the crime. But his testimony was riddled with inconsistencies and failed to adequately explain the extensive evidence of planning and cover-up that prosecutors had presented. His description of the events didn't match the physical evidence found at the scene, and his emotional responses during testimony seemed calculated rather than genuine. The prosecution's cross-examination of Beau was devastating. They systematically dismantled his story, pointing out the contradictions between his testimony and the physical evidence. They highlighted the extensive nature of his cover-up efforts, arguing that someone who had truly acted in the heat of the moment would not have been capable of such methodical planning in the aftermath. They also pressed him about his affair and his communications with his mistress, forcing him to admit that he had been actively deceiving Jennifer and planning a future without her even before her death. This testimony reinforced their theory that Jennifer's pregnancy announcement had simply been the trigger for a murder that he had already been contemplating. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. They found Beau Rothwell guilty of first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abandonment of a corpse. The first-degree murder conviction indicated that they believed the prosecution's argument that the murder had been premeditated, not a spontaneous act of violence. The verdict was a vindication for Jennifer's family and friends, who had maintained throughout the trial that she deserved justice for the brutal way her life had been taken, but it was also a sobering reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to murder, often in situations where the warning signs are hidden from friends and family. On July 8, 2022, Beau Rothwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction. He received additional sentences for the tampering and abandonment charges, but these would run concurrently with the life sentence. At 31 years old, Beau Rothwell would spend the rest of his life in prison for the murder of his pregnant wife. During the sentencing hearing, Jennifer's family had the opportunity to address the court and describe the impact that her death had had on their lives. Her mother, Robin von Hausen, spoke tearfully about the daughter she had lost and the grandchild she would never meet. She described Jennifer as a bright, loving light who had believed she had found someone to share her life with, only to discover too late that she had married her killer. The family's victim impact statement painted a picture of a woman who had so much to live for and so much to offer the world. Jennifer had been planning for the future, excited about the possibility of becoming a mother, and looking forward to the next chapter of her life. Instead, her life was cut short by the man who had promised to love and protect her. The case of Jennifer Rothwell serves as a tragic reminder of the dangers that domestic violence poses even in relationships that appear healthy from the outside. Jennifer's internet searches before her death suggest that she had some awareness that her marriage was in trouble, but she likely never imagined that her husband was capable of the violence that would ultimately take her life. The prosecution's portrayal of Beau Rothwell as a methodical planner who saw murder as a solution to his marital problems highlights how domestic violence can escalate in unexpected ways. This was not a case of a man who lost control in a moment of passion, but rather someone who made a calculated decision that his wife's life was expendable if it stood in the way of his desired future. The discovery of Jennifer's search history also highlighted the isolation that many victims of domestic violence experience. Here was a woman who was researching how to handle her husband's potential anger about her pregnancy, rather than seeking help from friends or family. It suggests that she was aware of problems in her marriage, but felt she needed to handle them alone. For investigators and prosecutors, the case demonstrated the importance of thorough forensic investigation and the ways that modern technology can help build cases against defendants who attempt to cover up their crimes. Despite Beau's efforts to clean the crime scene and dispose of Jennifer's body, the physical evidence ultimately told the true story of what had happened in their home that night. The case also highlighted the role that digital evidence plays in modern criminal investigations. Text messages, internet search histories, and social media posts all provided crucial insights into the mindset and actions of both the victim and the perpetrator. This digital footprint helped investigators understand the dynamics of the Rothwell marriage and build a timeline of events leading up to Jennifer's death. For the community of Crevecoeur, the case was a shocking reminder that domestic violence can happen anywhere, even in affluent neighborhoods, among educated professionals. The image of Jennifer and Beau as a successful couple living the American dream was shattered by the revelation of the violence and deception that existed behind closed doors. The case also sparked conversations about the resources available to women who are experiencing domestic violence, and the importance of recognizing warning signs before situations escalate to murder. Jennifer's internet searches suggest that she was aware of problems in her marriage, but she may not have known where to turn for help, or may not have recognized the level of danger she was in. As Beau Rothwell began his life sentence, Jennifer's family and friends were left to mourn, not just her death, but also the future that had been stolen from her. She would never see her child born, never experience the joy of motherhood, never had the chance to build the family she had been hoping for. Her death was not just the end of her own life, but the end of all the possibilities that had stretched out before her. The case remains a stark reminder of the ultimate cost of domestic violence and the importance of taking threats and warning signs seriously. For every person who heard about Jennifer's story, it served as a call to action to be more aware of the signs of abuse and to take steps to help those who may be in danger. In the end, justice was served for Jennifer Rothwell, but it came at a price that no family should have to pay. Her death was preventable, a tragedy that resulted from one man's decision to choose violence over divorce, murder over accountability. The case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers and prosecutors who work to ensure that those who commit such crimes are held accountable for their actions. But perhaps most importantly, Jennifer Rothwell's story serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when domestic violence is allowed to escalate unchecked. Her death was not just a statistic or a case number, but the loss of a bright, talented woman who had so much to offer the world and whose life was cut tragically short by the person who should have protected her most. Today, as Beau Rothwell serves his life sentence, Jennifer's family continues to honor her memory and advocate for other victims of domestic violence. They have worked to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse and the resources available to those who need help. In doing so, they hope to prevent other families from experiencing the heartbreak and loss that they have endured. The murder of Jennifer Rothwell was a senseless tragedy that shocked the community and highlighted the hidden dangers that can exist in seemingly perfect relationships. It was a case that demonstrated the importance of believing victims, taking threats seriously, and working to create a society where women can live without fear of violence from their intimate partners. As we remember Jennifer Rothwell, we remember not just the way she died, but the way she lived as a talented engineer, a loving daughter, and a woman who was excited about the future and the family she hoped to build. Her death was a profound loss, but her memory continues to inspire efforts to prevent domestic violence and protect other women who may be in danger. The case closed with Beau Rothwell behind bars for life, but the impact of his actions will be felt forever by those who loved Jennifer and by a community that was forced to confront the reality that domestic violence can happen anywhere, to anyone, regardless of education, income, or social status. In the end, Jennifer Rothwell's story is both a tragedy and a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in preventing domestic violence and protecting those who may be vulnerable to abuse. If you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're traveling to the quiet corners of the Midwest, where Halloween night 2014 would forever change the lives of two families and expose a truth so devastating that it would take nearly 5 years to surface. This is the story of Kaylin Leslie Whitaker, a vibrant 20-year-old whose life was cut short on October. But this isn't just a story about a murder, it's a story about love that turned deadly, about a family's unwavering faith in their daughter's memory, and about how sometimes the most shocking confessions come from the most unexpected places. The story begins with a frantic 911 call in the early morning hours of November 1st, 2014. A young man's voice, shaking with what sounded like genuine terror and grief, reported that his fiancée had shot herself in the head. That young man was Connor Scott, and his fiancée was Kaylin Whitaker. For nearly 5 years, Connor's version of events would stand as the official account of what happened that Halloween night. But families know their children in ways that others cannot. And sometimes, a mother's intuition is stronger than any official investigation. This is also the story of Leslie Roberts, Kaylin's mother, who refused to accept that her daughter had taken her own life, even when everyone around her, police, coroners, friends, seemed to believe otherwise. To understand the tragedy of what happened to Kaylin Whitaker, you first need to understand who she was, not as a victim, but as a living, breathing young woman, with dreams, talents, and a future that stretched endlessly before her. Kaylin Leslie Whitaker was born on October 12, 1994, in Terre Haute, Indiana, to David Whitaker and Leslie Roberts. From the very beginning, she was a child who seemed to glow with an inner light that drew people to her. She was definitely a high-spirited, life-loving person, with an artistic streak and a love for stray animals and country music, as her mother would later remember. Growing up in Terre Haute, Kaylin was the kind of child who found beauty in everything around her. She had a brilliant sense of creativity as a wonderful artist, spending hours sketching and painting, lost in worlds of her own creation. Art wasn't just a hobby for Kaylin, it was how she expressed herself, how she made sense of the world around her. Music was another passion that flowed through Kaylin's life like a constant melody. She played the cello in the orchestra at Terre Haute North Vigo High School, where she graduated, and picture her there, sitting with perfect posture, her fingers dancing across the strings, creating beautiful music that filled the school auditorium. Her fellow musicians remember her as someone who brought joy to their rehearsals, who could make even the most challenging pieces seem effortless. But perhaps what people remember most about Kaylin was her compassion. She had a soft spot for animals, especially strays, the forgotten ones, the ones that others had given up on. She would bring home injured birds, stray cats, any creature that needed care. Her mother would sometimes joke that their house was like a wildlife refuge, but she never had the heart to say no to Kaylin's rescue missions. This compassion, this need to care for others, was simply part of who Kaylin was. After graduating from high school, Kaylin enrolled at Ivy Tech College in their business program. She had dreams of running her own business someday. Maybe something that combined her artistic talents with her business acumen. She wasn't sure exactly what form it would take, but she was excited about the possibilities. She was the kind of young woman who believed she could do anything if she set her mind to it. At 20 years old, Kaylin stood at the threshold of her adult life. She had her education, her talents, her dreams, and most importantly, she had love. Or at least, what she believed was love. Those who knew Kaylin during this time describe her as someone who was genuinely happy. She had that glow that comes with being young and in love, the kind of happiness that makes you believe that everything is possible. She would talk excitedly about her future, about the wedding she was planning, about the life she was going to build. But happiness, as we know, can be fragile. And sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who pose the greatest danger to us. Kaylin and Connor Scott first met through a mutual friend and began dating during their senior year of high school. Their connection was immediate and intense. the kind of attraction that often happens when you're young and your whole life feels like it's just beginning. Their bond was pretty instant, recalls Elizabeth Grassick, Kaylin's close friend since junior high and her coworker at the Green Acres Dairy Bar in Terre Haute, Indiana. Elizabeth had watched Kaylin navigate the typical ups and downs of teenage relationships, but this one felt different from the start. He was sweet, Elizabeth remembered. He was good to Kaylin. He took Kaylin out on a lot of dates, spent money on Kaylin. They were in love, for sure. Connor seemed to be everything a teenage girl could want in a boyfriend: attentive, generous, romantic. He would surprise Kaylin with flowers, take her to nice restaurants, shower her with the kind of attention that made her feel special, cherished. Kaylin's family initially believed that Scott seemed like a pretty good guy, and it's easy to understand why. When Connor was around Kaylin's family, he was charming, polite, respectful. He seemed genuinely smitten with their daughter, and they could see how happy he made her. Leslie Roberts, Kaylin's mother, observed the same thing. Kaylin loved Connor, Roberts says, and Connor adored her. He really did. I could tell by the way he looked at her. There's something particularly heartbreaking about this observation, knowing what we know now about how the story ends. In those early days, Connor's devotion seemed genuine. His love for Kaylin appeared real. The relationship moved quickly, as young love often does. When you're 17, 18 years old and you believe you've found your soulmate, waiting seems pointless. Why wait when you could start building your life together right now? This urgency, this feeling that love conquers all, is both beautiful and dangerous in the hands of the wrong person. After high school, as Kaylin started college and began thinking about her future, Connor became an even more central part of her life. They talked about marriage, about the life they would build together, and eventually Connor proposed. Kaylin said yes. Of course, she was in love, she was young, and she believed in happy endings. But even in those early days, there were signs that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. The relationship soon soured, though the changes were gradual, subtle at first. Kaylin's mother said that Scott was demanding and controlling, but these weren't the kind of dramatic red flags that you see in movies. They were smaller things, the kind of behaviors that could be explained away or rationalized. Connor wanted to know where Kaylin was all the time. He would get upset if she spent time with friends without him. He had opinions about what she wore, who she talked to, how she spent her time, but he was her fiancé, after all. Wasn't it natural for him to care about these things? Looking back, these were the warning signs that often precede domestic violence. But when you're in the middle of it, and you love someone, it's easy to make excuses. Maybe he's just protective. Maybe he loves me so much that he can't bear to be apart from me. Maybe this is what love is supposed to feel like. The relationship dynamics that were developing between Kaylin and Connor were unfortunately all too common. What starts as devotion can gradually transform into possession. What begins as protection can slowly become control, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're often so deep in the relationship that it's hard to see a way out. But for now, in those early days, Connor Scott was still the devoted boyfriend, and Kaylin Whitaker was still a young woman in love, planning for a future that she would never get to see. As their relationship progressed, Kaylin and Connor began talking about taking the next step, moving in together. For young couples in love, this feels like a natural progression, a way to deepen their commitment and start building their shared future. But for Kaylin's family, particularly her mother Leslie, this development brought a mixture of emotions. Though Roberts raised concerns about the acceleration of Kaylin's move-in with her fiancé, if she had her mind set on something, there wasn't much anyone could do to change it. This was part of Kaylin's personality. Once she decided on something, she was determined to see it through. It was a trait that had served her well in many areas of her life, but in this case, it meant that her family's gentle concerns were met with the kind of loving but firm resistance that many parents know all too well. The couple found a place in Martinsville, Illinois, a small town where Connor felt they could build their life together. It wasn't far from Terre Haute, but it was far enough to feel like they were starting fresh, creating their own space away from the watchful eyes of family and friends. The house they moved into had a basement bedroom, and this became their private sanctuary, their own little world where they could be together without interference from the outside. Living together brought new dimensions to their relationship, both good and challenging. On the positive side, they could spend more time together, share daily routines, and play house in the way that young couples do. They could cook meals together, watch movies late into the night, and wake up next to each other every morning. For Kaylin, who was deeply in love, this felt like a dream come true. But living together also intensified some of the controlling behaviors that had been developing in Connor. When you share a living space with someone, their influence on your daily life becomes much more pronounced. Connor's need to know where Kaylin was and what she was doing became easier to monitor and control when they were living under the same roof. Friends who visited noticed that Connor rarely left Kaylin alone with them. He would linger nearby during conversations, or find reasons to interrupt when Kaylin was talking to others. What might have seemed like attentiveness to casual observers felt more possessive to those who knew Kaylin well. Elizabeth Grassick, who had remained close to Kaylin throughout the relationship, began to notice changes in her friend. Kaylin seemed more subdued sometimes, less spontaneous. She was still the same warm, caring person. But there was something different about her when Connor was around, a kind of heightened awareness of his moods and reactions. But these changes were gradual, and Kaylin was still very much in love. She was planning their wedding, talking excitedly about their future together. She would show off her engagement ring to anyone who would look, and she seemed genuinely happy about the prospect of becoming Mrs. Connor Scott. The basement bedroom where they slept became their most private space. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with personal touches that reflected both of their personalities. Kaylin had added some of her artwork to the walls, little splashes of color and creativity that made the space feel more like home. This room, which should have been a place of love and safety, would ultimately become the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. But for now, it was simply the bedroom of two young people in love, planning their future together, unaware of how that future would be cut short. As the months passed, Kaylin seemed to settle into their shared life. She continued her studies at Ivy Tech, continued working, continued making plans for their wedding. On the surface, everything appeared normal, even happy, but beneath the surface, the dynamics of their relationship continued to shift in ways that would ultimately prove deadly. The stage was being set for a tragedy that no one could have predicted, least of all Kaylin herself, who went to bed on October 30th, 2014, never knowing that she would never wake up again. The last few days of October 2014 passed quietly for Kaylin and Connor. Halloween was approaching, and for most people it was a time of excitement and celebration. But for this young couple, it would mark the end of everything they had built together. In the days leading up to October 31st, there was no indication that anything was dramatically wrong. Kaylin went about her usual routine, attending classes at Ivy Tech, working, spending time with Connor. To outside observers, they seemed like any other young couple navigating the ordinary challenges of life together. But those closest to Kaylin had continued to notice subtle changes in her demeanor over the months. While she was still the warm, artistic, animal-loving young woman they had always known, there was something different about her when Connor was around. She seemed more careful about what she said, more aware of his reactions to her words and actions. These changes were the kind that are only visible to people who know you well, and even then, they're easy to dismiss or explain away. Young relationships have their ups and downs, after all. Living together can be an adjustment. Planning a wedding can be stressful. There are 100 reasonable explanations for why someone might seem a little different, a little more subdued. Elizabeth Grassick, Kaylin's close friend from junior high, had maintained contact with her throughout the relationship with Connor. But she had noticed that their conversations had changed. Kaylin was still warm and friendly, but she seemed less likely to confide in her friends about any problems she might be having. Whether this was because there were no problems to confide, or because she felt she couldn't confide them, is something we'll never know. What we do know is that in the final days of her life, Kaylin was still making plans for the future. She was still talking about the wedding, still attending classes, still living as if she had decades ahead of her. There's no evidence that she was depressed or suicidal. There's no indication that she was planning to end her life. On October 30th, Kaylin and Connor spent a quiet evening at home. They had dinner together, watched television, went about the ordinary routines of a couple who had been living together for months. It was a Thursday night, unremarkable in every way except that it would be Kaylin's last night alive. The next day, October 31st, was Halloween. For most people, it was a day of costumes and candy, of horror movies and haunted houses. The fear was supposed to be fun, temporary, the kind that makes you laugh when the lights come back on. But for Kaylin Whitaker, Halloween 2014 would bring a horror that was all too real. As the day wore on, Kaylin and Connor went about their normal routines. There's no record of any major arguments or dramatic confrontations. Whatever happened that night, whatever led to the tragedy that was about to unfold, it emerged from the ordinary rhythms of their shared life. As evening approached, they prepared for bed in their basement bedroom. Kaylin, like millions of other young women around the world, probably spent a few minutes getting ready for sleep. Maybe checking her phone, maybe thinking about the next day's plans. She had no way of knowing that she would never see another sunrise. The last person to see Kaylin Whitaker alive was the same person who would claim to find her dead the next morning. Connor Scott would tell police that they had gone to bed together, that everything was normal, that he had fallen asleep beside the woman he claimed to love. But sometime in the dark hours of that Halloween night, something happened in that basement bedroom that would change everything. And for nearly 5 years, only one person would know the truth about what really occurred in those final moments of Kaylin's life. The basement bedroom was quiet in the early hours of November 1st, 2014. Outside, the last remnants of Halloween festivities were winding down, and the small town of Martinsville, Illinois was settling into the peaceful sleep of a community where nothing bad ever happens. Inside the house, Kaylin Whitaker and Connor Scott were in bed together, as they had been countless nights before. This was their private sanctuary, their place away from the world, where they could be alone together, as a couple planning their future. But on this night, something was different. Something was terribly, tragically wrong. According to Connor Scott's accounts, the only account investigators would have for nearly 5 years, he was awakened from sleep by a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was the sound of a gunshot, loud and shocking in the quiet of the early morning hours. Connor would later tell police that in that moment between sleep and waking, he was confused, disoriented. You know that feeling when you're jolted awake by a sudden noise, when your brain struggles to make sense of what you've heard. Connor described experiencing exactly that, a moment of confusion where he couldn't understand what had happened. Then he said he saw Kaylin beside him in the bed. She was lying there, blood pooling around her head. She had been shot in the head at close range, and she was dead. The scene that Connor described finding was beyond most people's worst nightmares. The woman he claimed to love, the woman he was engaged to marry, lying dead beside him in their bed. The shock of such a discovery would be overwhelming for anyone, and Connor's reaction seemed to match what you might expect from someone who had just witnessed such a horror. In a panic, Connor called 911. The call came in at approximately 5:30 a.m. on November 1st, 2014. Connor's voice on that call was shaky, desperate, filled with what sounded like genuine shock and grief. He told the dispatcher that his fiancée had shot herself, that she was dead. The emotion in his voice seemed real, the confusion and terror unmistakable. She shot herself, Connor told the dispatcher, his voice breaking. She's dead. There's blood everywhere. The desperation in his voice was palpable, the kind of raw emotion that's difficult to fake. He sounded like a man who had just witnessed something that would haunt him forever. The 911 dispatcher, trained to handle emergency situations, tried to keep Connor calm while getting the essential information. They asked about Kaylin's condition, about the location of the gun, about whether Connor was safe. All of Connor's responses seemed consistent with someone who had just discovered a suicide. When the first responders arrived at the scene, they found Connor in a state of apparent shock. He was distraught, crying, seeming genuinely devastated by what had happened. The paramedics and police officers who responded that morning had seen suicide scenes before, and Connor's reaction didn't immediately raise any red flags. They found Kaylin's body in the basement bedroom, lying in bed where Connor said he had found her. She was wearing pajamas, and the scene initially appeared consistent with suicide. There was a gun nearby, .22 caliber rifle, and the single gunshot wound to her head seemed at first glance to support Connor's account. But even in those first moments, some of the responding officers felt that something was off. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what makes a scene feel wrong. but experienced police officers develop an instinct for these things. The positioning of the gun, the angle of the wound, the overall arrangement of the scene, something didn't quite add up. However, suicide is unfortunately common, and the initial evidence seemed to support Connor's story. He was questioned at the scene, and his story remained consistent. He said he had been asleep beside Kaylin, that he had been awakened by the gunshot, that he had found her dead. He seems genuinely distraught, and there was no obvious evidence of a struggle or violence. The gun that killed Kaylin was legally owned and had been in the house. This detail initially supported the suicide theory. It suggested that Kaylin had access to the weapon and could have used it on herself. But as the initial shock of the scene wore off and investigators began to look more carefully at the evidence, questions began to emerge. The angle of the gunshot wound was unusual for a suicide. The positioning of the gun didn't quite make sense, and there was something about Connor's story that felt slightly off, though investigators couldn't put their finger on exactly what it was. Still, the initial determination was that Kaylin Whitaker had died by suicide. Connor Scott was the grieving fiancé, the victim of a tragedy that had taken the woman he loved away from him. The case was processed as a suicide, and Connor was free to begin the difficult process of grieving and moving on with his life. But Kaylin's family, particularly her mother Leslie Roberts, couldn't accept this explanation. They knew their daughter knew her dreams and plans for the future, and suicide simply didn't fit with the Kaylin they knew and loved. In the devastating aftermath of losing a child, families often struggle with a mixture of grief, confusion, and the desperate need to understand what happened. But for Leslie Roberts, Kaylin's mother, there was another feeling that grew stronger with each passing day, the absolute certainty that her daughter had not taken her own life. It was the persistence of Whitaker's mother that brought out the truth, as local pathologist and medical examiner Dr. Roland Kaur would later observe. She wanted to see justice for her daughter. She couldn't believe that her daughter would commit suicide. Unfortunately, most suicides, when they are legitimate suicides, the family doesn't want to accept it. But in this case, I was 100% behind her, because the evidence simply didn't support the suicide conclusion. Leslie Roberts knew her daughter in the way that only a mother can. She had watched Kaylin grow from a creative, compassionate child into a young woman with dreams and ambitions. She had seen her daughter's excitement about her engagement, her plans for the wedding, her enthusiasm about building a life with Connor. None of it added up to suicide. In the days and weeks following Kaylin's death, Leslie became a detective in her own right. She asked questions, pressed for answers, and refused to accept the official determination that her daughter had killed herself. She knew that investigating her daughter's death would be painful, that it would mean reliving the trauma again and again, but she was determined to find the truth. The initial police investigation had been thorough but brief. When a death appears to be suicide, there's often less intensive investigation than there would be for an obvious homicide. But Leslie's persistent questions began to shed light on inconsistencies that hadn't been fully explored. One of the most significant issues was the forensic evidence. Later, after analyzing Kaylin's wound, forensic experts doubted that Kaylin could have shot herself based on the spot the bullet entered her skull, the angle of the wound, the trajectory of the bullet, the positioning of the gun. All of these details suggested that it would have been physically difficult, if not impossible, for Kaylin to have inflicted this wound on herself. There was also the question of gunshot residue. When someone fires a gun, residue from the gunpowder typically gets on their hands and clothing. This residue can be detected through forensic testing, and it's one of the ways investigators can determine whether someone fired a weapon. The testing on Kaylin's hands showed inconsistent results for someone who had supposedly just fired a gun. But perhaps most compelling of all was the psychological evidence. Leslie knew that her daughter had been happy, excited about her future, making plans for her wedding. There had been no signs of depression, no suicidal ideation, no indication that Kaylin was struggling with mental health issues that might lead to suicide. Friends and family members supported Leslie's conviction that Kaylin wouldn't have taken her own life. Elizabeth Grassick, Kaylin's close friend, echoed these sentiments. While she had noticed some changes in Kaylin's behavior during her relationship with Connor, there had been nothing to suggest that Kaylin was suicidal. As Leslie continued to press for answers, she also began to look more closely at Connor Scott's behavior. both before and after Kaylin's death. The controlling behaviors that had concerned her during Kaylin's life took on new significance in light of her daughter's death. Had Connor's possessiveness escalated into something more dangerous? Leslie's persistence began to pay off. 10 months after she was killed, Kaylin's death was reclassified as a homicide. This was a significant victory for Leslie and the family, but it was also just the beginning of their fight for justice. Having a death reclassified as homicide is one thing. Proving who committed the murder is another. Despite the coroner's new determination, investigators still didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone with Kaylin's murder. The case was officially a homicide, but it was also officially unsolved. This left the family in a particularly difficult position. They had succeeded in having Kaylin's death recognized as murder, but they still didn't have justice. Connor Scott remained free, and there was no guarantee that he would ever be charged with the crime. For Leslie Roberts, this meant that her fight was far from over. She had proven that her daughter hadn't committed suicide, but she still needed to prove who had killed her, and she was determined to keep fighting until she got the answers she needed. The reclassification of Kaylin's death as homicide was a bittersweet victory for her family. They had been vindicated in their belief that their daughter hadn't committed suicide, but they were still left without answers about who had killed her and why. Still, there were no arrests made in the case, despite the homicide determination. This is the reality of many murder investigations. Having a victim and even having suspicions about who might be responsible doesn't automatically translate into charges being filed. Prosecutors need evidence that will convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, and that level of evidence simply didn't exist in Kaylin's case. Connor Scott, meanwhile, had moved on with his life. He had relocated to Indiana, starting fresh in a new state where people didn't know about his connection to a murder investigation. To his new neighbors and co-workers, he was simply a young man who had tragically lost his fiancée to suicide. The truth about the homicide investigation wasn't something he advertised. From the outside, Connor appeared to be rebuilding his life after a terrible tragedy. He found work, he made new friends, he seemed to be moving forward. But what was happening inside his mind during those years? Was he haunted by what he had done? Did he live in fear that the truth would eventually catch up with him? Or had he convinced himself that he had gotten away with murder? For the investigators working Kaylin's case, these were frustrating years. They had a homicide with no arrests, no new leads, and a case that seemed to have gone cold. Detective work requires evidence, and despite their suspicions about Connor, they didn't have the concrete proof they needed to bring charges. Cold cases are the nightmares of law enforcement. They represent victims who haven't received justice, families who haven't received closure, and the possibility that dangerous criminals are walking free. Investigators don't give up on these cases, but they also can't work on them full-time when new crimes are constantly occurring. The case file for Kaylin Whitaker remained open, but it gathered dust on shelves alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. Occasionally, an investigator would pull it out, review the evidence, hope that new technology or a fresh perspective might reveal something that had been missed. But year after year, the case remained stuck. For Kaylin's family, particularly her mother Leslie, these were years of agonizing uncertainty. They had gotten the official recognition that their daughter had been murdered, but they still didn't have justice. They lived with the knowledge that Kaylin's killer was walking free, possibly living a normal life while their daughter lay in her grave. The pain of losing a child is unimaginable under any circumstances, but losing a child to murder and then not getting justice adds another layer of trauma that can be overwhelming. Leslie Roberts had to find a way to live with the dual burden of grief and injustice, never knowing if her daughter's killer would ever be held accountable. More than 4 years ago, their 20-year-old daughter Kaylin Whitaker died on Halloween night, under suspicious circumstances. Investigators say she was killed, but no one has been charged, as one news report summarized the situation in late 2018, nearly 4 years after the murder. During these cold case years, the family tried to keep Kaylin's memory alive and keep public attention on her case. They gave interviews to local news stations, participated in true crime shows, and did everything they could to ensure that people didn't forget about Kaylin or stop looking for answers about her death. But as the years passed, hope began to fade. 4 years is a long time in a murder investigation. Evidence degrades, witnesses' memories fade, and the trail grows ever colder. By 2018, It seemed increasingly likely that Kaylin's murder would join the ranks of unsolved cases that haunt police departments across the country. Leslie Roberts, however, never gave up hope. She continued to believe that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. She didn't know how it would happen, but she held on to faith that justice would eventually be served. That faith would be tested for nearly 5 years. 5 years of wondering, of hoping, of living with the pain of not knowing if her daughter's killer would ever face consequences for his actions. 5 years of watching Connor Scott live his life as a free man, while Kaylin remained in her grave. But sometimes the human conscience is a powerful thing. Sometimes the weight of guilt becomes too much to bear. And sometimes the truth finds a way to surface, even years after everyone has given up hope. February 24th, 2019. Started like any other Sunday for the officers working at the Danville Metropolitan Police Department in Indiana. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the most exciting thing might be a traffic violation or a minor disturbance. But then, something extraordinary happened that would change everything. A man walked into an Indiana police station Sunday to confess to the murder of his girlfriend, who was found dead with a gunshot wound to the head on Halloween night 2014. That man was Connor Scott, now 24 years old, nearly 4.5 years after Kaylin Whitaker's death. The desk sergeant, who first encountered Connor, probably thought he was dealing with someone who was mentally disturbed or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. People don't typically walk into police stations and confess to murders they've gotten away with for years, but Connor Scott was sober, coherent, and deadly serious. "I need to speak with a detective," Connor said. "I killed my fiancée." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. The officer who heard them could hardly believe what he was hearing. Cold cases are rarely solved by the perpetrator simply walking in and confessing, but that's exactly what was happening. Connor was taken to an interview room, where detectives sat him down and began recording what would become one of the most shocking confessions in the department's history. "I killed Kaylin Whitaker," Connor repeated, his voice steady but filled with what seemed like years of pent-up guilt. "I shot her in the head while she was sleeping. It wasn't suicide. I lied to everyone." The detectives conducting the interview had to maintain their professional composure, but inside they were reeling. Here was a case that had been cold for nearly 5 years. A case that had frustrated investigators and tormented a family, suddenly being solved by the perpetrator's own admission. Connor's confession was detailed and chilling. He admitted to shooting Kaylin in the head as she lay sleeping in their bed on Halloween night. He described staging the scene to make it look like suicide, placing the gun near her body and then calling 911 to report that he had found her dead. "I loved her," Connor said during the confession, "but I killed her." These words would haunt everyone who heard them. The contradiction between claiming love and committing the ultimate act of violence against someone. The confession answered the question that had haunted investigators for years, but it also raised new ones. Why now? What had prompted Connor to walk into a police station and confess to a murder he had gotten away with for nearly 5 years? Connor told investigators that the guilt had been eating away at him for years. He said he couldn't live with the secret anymore, that he needed to tell the truth about what had happened to Kaylin. He described years of nightmares, of being unable to form meaningful relationships, of living with the knowledge that he had taken the life of someone he claimed to love. The psychological toll of carrying such a secret for nearly 5 years must have been enormous. Connor had been living a lie, presenting himself to the world as the grieving fiancé of a suicide victim, while knowing that he was actually her killer. The weight of that deception, combined with whatever guilt he felt about the murder itself, had apparently become unbearable. During the confession, Connor provided details about the crime that only the killer could have known. He described the positioning of Kaylin's body, the location of the gun, the sequence of events that night. These details corroborated the investigators' suspicions and provided the concrete evidence they had been lacking for years. The confession was both a moment of vindication and a moment of profound sadness. For investigators, it represented the solution to a case that had frustrated them for years. For Kaylin's family, it was validation of their belief that their daughter hadn't committed suicide, but it was also a devastating confirmation that the person they had suspected all along was indeed their daughter's killer. Connor Scott was arrested immediately after his confession. He was held in Indiana pending extradition to Illinois, where he would face charges for Kaylin's murder. After nearly 5 years of freedom, Connor Scott was finally in custody for the crime he had committed on Halloween night. The news of Connor's confession sent shockwaves through both communities involved in the case. In Martinsville, Illinois, where Kalen had been killed, people were stunned to learn that what they had believed was a suicide was actually murder. In Terre Haute, Indiana, where Kalen's family lived, the news brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. When Leslie Roberts received the phone call telling her that Connor Scott had confessed to murdering her daughter, she experienced a complex mix of emotions that would be difficult for anyone to understand who hasn't walked in her shoes. There was relief, the overwhelming relief of finally knowing the truth, of being vindicated in her belief that Kalen hadn't committed suicide. For nearly 5 years, Leslie had carried the burden of knowing that her daughter's death had been misunderstood, that people believed Kalen had taken her own life when Leslie knew in her heart that wasn't true. But there was also renewed grief. The confession confirmed what Leslie had suspected all along, that her daughter had been murdered by the person who claimed to love her most. The betrayal was profound. Connor Scott had not only killed Kalen, but he had then looked Leslie in the eye at the funeral, had accepted condolences for his loss, had played the role of the grieving fiancé while knowing that he was actually the killer. "I always knew she didn't kill herself," Leslie told reporters after learning of Connor's confession. Kalen was excited about her future, about her wedding, about her life. She would never have taken her own life. The vindication was important, but it came at the cost of confirming that her daughter had died in the most horrible way possible. For other family members and friends, the confession brought similar mixed emotions. They were glad to finally have answers, but they were also horrified by the truth. Elizabeth Grassick, Kalen's close friend, had suspected that something wasn't right about Connor, but even she was shocked by the confession. "I always thought there was something off about him," Elizabeth said, "but I never imagined he was capable of murder." Kalen loved him so much. She trusted him completely. The betrayal of that trust was perhaps the most painful aspect of the whole situation. The confession also brought up difficult questions about the warning signs that had been present in Connor and Kalen's relationship. The controlling behavior, the possessiveness, the isolation, these were all red flags that in hindsight seemed to point toward potential violence, but at the time they had been easy to dismiss or explain away. Domestic violence experts often point out that the most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave their abuser, but in Kalen's case, there's no evidence that she was planning to leave Connor. She was still wearing her engagement ring, still planning their wedding, still talking about their future together. This makes her murder even more senseless and tragic. The family also had to grapple with the realization that Connor had been living a normal life for nearly 5 years, while they had been consumed with grief in the search for justice. He had been working, possibly dating, maybe even forming new relationships, all while carrying the secret of what he had done to Kalen. "He stole 5 years from us," Leslie said. 5 years of wondering, of not knowing, of fighting for the truth. He could have confessed right away, but instead he let us suffer. The additional cruelty of allowing the family to believe that Kalen had committed suicide was almost unbearable. But despite the pain and anger, Leslie Roberts also felt a sense of closure beginning to form. For the first time in nearly 5 years, she knew the truth about what had happened to her daughter. The uncertainty that had plagued her for so long was finally over. "Now we can focus on getting justice for Kalen," Leslie said. "We know who killed her, and we're going to make sure he pays for what he did." The fight for justice was far from over, but at least now they knew who they were fighting against. After Connor Scott's confession in Indiana, the legal machinery began to move. He was arrested and held pending extradition to Illinois, where Kalen had been killed and where he would face murder charges. The extradition process is usually routine, but it gave Connor time to reconsider his confession and potentially change his mind about cooperating with authorities. But Connor didn't recant his confession. He waived his right to fight extradition and agreed to be transferred to Illinois to face charges. This suggested that his confession was genuine and that he was prepared to face the consequences of his actions. Once Connor was transferred to Illinois, he was formally charged with first-degree murder and the death of Kalen Whitaker. He was held on a $1 million bond in the Clark County Jail, a sum that reflected the seriousness of the charges and the flight risk he potentially posed. The formal charges marked a significant milestone in the case. For nearly 5 years, Kalen's murder had been unsolved. Now finally, someone was being held accountable for her death. The legal process would still take time, but at least it had begun. Initially, despite his confession, Connor pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. This might seem contradictory, but it's actually not uncommon in the legal system. The confession doesn't automatically equal a guilty plea, and defendants have the right to have their case heard in court, even if they've confessed to police. The not guilty plea meant that the case would potentially go to trial, where Connor's confession would be presented as evidence, along with all the other evidence that had been gathered over the years. This would be a difficult process for Kaylin's family, who would have to sit through detailed testimony about how their daughter died. But the trial process can also be important for families seeking closure. It allows them to hear all the evidence, to understand exactly what happened, and to see the defendant held accountable in a public forum. For Leslie Roberts and her family, this was an important part of getting justice for Kaylin. As the case moved through the legal system, Connor's defense team likely worked to understand why their client had confessed and whether there were any mitigating circumstances that might reduce his sentence. They may have explored his mental health history, his relationship with Kaylin, and the circumstances that led to the murder. But the evidence against Connor was overwhelming. He had confessed to the crime, providing details that only the killer could have known. The forensic evidence supported his confession, and the family's testimony about Kaylin's state of mind contradicted any suggestion that she had committed suicide. Faced with this evidence, Connor's legal team likely advised him that going to trial would be risky. A jury would hear his confession, would see the evidence, and would likely convict him. The question became whether he would be better served by accepting a plea agreement that might result in a lighter sentence than what he might receive if convicted at trial. Eventually, Connor Scott made the decision to change his plea from not guilty to guilty. This meant that there would be no trial, no drawn-out legal proceedings that would force Kaylin's family to relive the trauma of her death in excruciating detail. The guilty plea was a significant moment for everyone involved. For Kaylin's family, it represented acknowledgement of responsibility from the person who had killed their daughter. For Connor, it was an admission of guilt that would determine the rest of his life. But even with the guilty plea, the legal process wasn't over. There would still be a sentencing hearing, where Connor would learn how many years he would spend in prison for Kaylin's murder. This would be the family's opportunity to tell the court about the impact of Kaylin's death on their lives. On October 1st, 2019, nearly 5 years after Kaylin Whitaker's death, Connor Scott appeared before Judge Michael McFadridge for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with Kaylin's family and friends, all of whom had waited years for this moment of justice. This sentencing hearing was emotional for everyone involved. This was the moment when Kaylin's family would finally have the opportunity to tell Connor Scott directly how his actions had affected their lives. It was also the moment when Connor would learn how many years he would spend in prison for his crime. Before the sentencing, several family members had the opportunity to read victim impact statements. These statements are designed to help the court understand the full impact of the crime on the victim's loved ones, and they often provide the most powerful moments in a sentencing hearing. Leslie Roberts, Kaylin's mother, spoke first. She had waited nearly 5 years for this opportunity to tell Connor exactly what he had taken from her family. Her statement was heartbreaking in its honesty and devastating in its impact. "Connor, you didn't just kill my daughter," Leslie said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "You killed a part of me, a part of all of us. You took away her future, her dreams, her chance to become the woman she was meant to be. You took away my chance to walk her down the aisle, to hold her children, to grow old with her." Leslie also spoke about the additional cruelty of Connor's deception. "For 5 years, you let us believe that Kaylin had taken her own life. You let us wonder if there was something we could have done to save her. You let us carry the guilt of thinking we had missed the signs of her depression. That cruelty was almost as unbearable as losing her in the first place." Other family members and friends also spoke, each one describing how Kaylin's death had affected their lives. They spoke about the hole her absence had left in their families, about the celebrations she would never attend, about the future that had been stolen from all of them. Elizabeth Grassick, Kaylin's close friend, spoke about the vibrant, creative young woman who had been taken from them. Kaylin was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel special, she said. She had so much love to give, so much life to live. Connor took all of that away, not just from her, but from all of us who loved her. Throughout these statements, Connor Scott sat quietly, showing little visible emotion. This lack of reaction was particularly painful for Kaylin's family. who had hoped to see some sign of remorse or understanding of the gravity of what he had done. When it was Connor's turn to speak, he offered a brief statement expressing remorse for his actions. But his words felt hollow to Kaylin's family, who had endured nearly 5 years of lies and deception from him. An apology, no matter how sincere, could never undo the damage he had caused. Judge McFatridge then pronounced Connor's sentence, 37 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. The sentence was significant, reflecting the seriousness of the crime and the impact it had on Kaylin's family and community. At 24 years old, Connor Scott would spend the majority of his adult life behind bars. He would be in his 60s before he would be eligible for release, assuming he served his full sentence. It was in many ways a life sentence for someone so young. For Kaylin's family, the sentence represented justice, but it was bittersweet justice. No amount of prison time could bring Kaylin back or undo the pain they had endured. But it did mean that Connor Scott would be held accountable for his actions and that he would not be free to hurt anyone else. 37 years doesn't seem like enough for taking someone's life, Leslie Roberts said after the sentencing. But at least he'll be in prison where he belongs, and he won't be able to hurt anyone else the way he hurt Kaylin. Even with Connor Scott's confession, conviction, and sentencing, many questions about Kaylin Whitaker's murder remain unanswered. The most pressing of these is perhaps the simplest. Why did Connor Scott kill the woman he claimed to love? The woman he was engaged to marry? What happened in that basement bedroom on Halloween night 2014 that led to Kaylin's death? Was it a crime of passion, sparked by an argument that escalated beyond all reason? Was it premeditated, planned in advance? Or was it something else entirely? Connor's confession provided the basic facts of what happened. He shot Kaylin in the head while she was sleeping, but it didn't explain his motivation. The psychological reasons behind his actions remain largely a mystery, locked away in Connor's own mind and perhaps not fully understood even by him. The other major question that haunts this case is why Connor waited nearly 5 years to confess. What finally prompted him to walk into that police station in February 2019 and admit to murder? Was it guilt that had been building for years? Was it the fear of being caught, or was it something else entirely? Connor has not spoken publicly about his motives, either for the murder or for his eventual confession. He remains in prison, serving his 37-year sentence, and it's unclear whether he will ever provide the full truth about what happened that night or why he chose to confess when he did. Some experts suggest that the weight of carrying such a secret for years can become unbearable. Living with the knowledge that you've killed someone, maintaining the lie that it was suicide, watching the victim's family suffer, all of this can create a psychological burden that eventually becomes too much to bear. Dr. Roland Kaur, the pathologist who worked on Kaylin's case, observed that guilt is a powerful motivator. He suggested that Connor's conscience may have finally gotten the better of him, forcing him to confront the truth about what he had done. But others wonder if there were more practical reasons for Connor's confession. Had he been worried that new evidence might emerge? Had he been concerned that advances in forensic technology might eventually expose his crime? Was he hoping that confessing voluntarily might result in a lighter sentence than being caught and convicted? These questions may never have satisfactory answers. Connor Scott has shown little inclination to explain his actions or his motivations, and there's no indication that he plans to do so in the future. For Kaylin's family, these unanswered questions are part of their ongoing grief. They have justice. Connor is in prison where he belongs, but they don't have complete closure. They know who killed their daughter, but they may never know why. The case also raises broader questions about domestic violence and the warning signs that may have been present in Connor and Kaylin's relationship. The controlling behavior, the possessiveness, the isolation. These are all red flags that, in hindsight, seem to point toward potential violence. But recognizing these warning signs and acting on them are two different things. Kaylin was an adult. She was in love, and she believed she could handle whatever problems existed in her relationship. Like many victims of domestic violence, she may not have recognized the danger she was in until it was too late. The tragedy of Kaylin's death is that it was preventable. If Connor had gotten help for whatever issues led him to violence, if Kaylin had recognized the warning signs and left a relationship, if friends and family had been more persistent in their concerns, any of these things might have saved her life. But we can't change the past. We can only learn from it and try to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As we close the story of Kaylin Whitaker, it's important to remember that Kaylin Whitaker was much more than a victim of violence. She was a daughter, a friend, an artist, and a young woman with dreams and ambitions that extended far beyond the tragedy that ended her life. Kaylin was someone who created beauty in the world through her art. She was someone who cared for stray animals and brought joy to her friends and family. She was someone who played the cello and made music that lifted people's spirits. She was someone who was excited about her future and had so much to give to the world. The fact that her life was cut short by violence is a tragedy that affects not just her family and friends, but all of us who believe that every life has value and potential. Kaylin's death represents not just the loss of one young woman, but the loss of all the contributions she might have made to the world if she had been allowed to live. Her mother, Leslie Roberts, has worked tirelessly to ensure that Kaylin is remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. She has kept her daughter's memory alive through interviews, advocacy, and by simply refusing to let the world forget about Kaylin. I want people to remember Kaylin for the beautiful, creative, loving person she was, Leslie has said. I don't want her to be remembered only as a murder victim. She was so much more than that. The story of Kaylin Whitaker is ultimately a story about the persistence of truth and the power of a mother's love. Leslie Roberts refused to accept the official determination that her daughter had committed suicide, even when it would have been easier to do so. She fought for years to get the truth about Kaylin's death, and her persistence was ultimately vindicated when Connor Scott confessed. It's also a story about the importance of listening to families who insist that something doesn't add up. Leslie Roberts knew her daughter in a way that investigators couldn't, and her insistence that Kaylin hadn't committed suicide was ultimately proven correct. Her fight for justice serves as an inspiration to other families who are dealing with similar situations. Connor Scott is now serving a 37-year sentence for Kaylin's murder. He will spend most of his adult life in prison, removed from society where he cannot hurt anyone else. This is justice, but it's justice that came too late for Kaylin. The best way to honor Kaylin's memory is to remember her life, not just her death. She was a young woman who loved art and music and animals. She was someone who made people smile and who had dreams for the future. She was someone who deserved to live a long, happy life, surrounded by the people who loved her. Today, Connor Scott sits in his prison cell, serving time for the life he took. Kaylin Whitaker rests in peace, finally having received the justice she deserved. Her family continues to grieve, but they also continue to celebrate her life and keep her memory alive. As we remember Kaylin's story, let's also remember to pay attention to the warning signs of domestic violence. Let's remember to take seriously the concerns of families who insist that something doesn't add up. And let's remember that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered and whose death leaves a hole in the world that can never be filled. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.